Hi, I'm Joey Ito. I'm the director of the MIT Media Lab, and
I'm Jonathan Zittrain, and director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University.
so we're going to talk for about an hour. No, I'm just kidding. We weren't in the program, but I really wanted to sort of introduce this because we have been working in this space of AI and ethics, and last year we actually tried to do a conference. But then we looked around and we saw, well, you know, I'm not afraid of the Kurzweilian singularity as much as the singularity where there's an AI conference every day, you know. And so one of the things we said, well, let's refactor, and we thought the AI Now conference looked like the most interesting conference that happened last year. Unfortunately, we weren't invited, so we decided if we hosted it, maybe we could get invited. So that was sort of my idea.
Which turned out not to be true, so we'll be leaving as soon as our introduction is over. Oh. We are part of a new venture called the Ethics and Governance in Artificial Intelligence Fund, and thought we'd say a little bit about that as well. I don't know if you want to say anything about the origins, Joey.
Yeah, we will have a session about that later, but basically it was Reid Hoffman, the Knight Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, and Pierre Omidyar, and Jim Pallotta got together, and and Kate and Meredith have been really helping us think about this, was that the funding of this space was just sort of non-existent. And the idea was that the philanthropists would try to get together to fund work that crossed over between the disciplines and increase the diversity, and convening was one of the key things that we thought was important. So Kate and Meredith have been super helpful with that.
And there are 3 zones that are opening zones of focus for the fund, which include autonomous vehicles, criminal justice risk scores for bail, probation, parole, and information quality / fake news, but we can't call it fake news. So those are sort of the 3 areas. And when I think about the title AI Now, it calls to mind, I think, as we're thinking about the space, for AI, we mean it writ large. We mean it colloquially, not as a term of art, because if you get 2 AI people in a room to talk about what is AI, there will be 3 views, one of which they will have programmed. And that is not what we're wondering, what's on what boundary of what. I think, at least for me, it's more of a mouthful, but we're thinking about tightly coupled autonomous systems that evolve over time and therefore can surprise even their makers. And for the now part, to me, now means now is stuff happening now that's going to require some thoughtful interventions, including, as with the founding and development of the internet itself, thinking about what belongs public, what belongs private, at what point is the public interest implicated enough that what 2 people are doing in a garage should have maybe a 3rd person along for the ride as soon as it starts to take off. And that also implicates the question of how easy is it to do AI, to build it? Is it something that requires a bunch of PhDs and a lot of resources, kind of a Microsoft Google thing? Or is it something a la the mythology of the internet that anybody in a room can do as they please? And that's different from some of the AI later questions that involve screenplays for the Terminator and stuff like that. There's plenty on our plates right now. And when I say the brain trust gathered in this room is incredible. And I know I'm really excited. I know you are too, Joey, at what we're going to learn with this kind of gathering, both in the formal sessions and just having chats outside. I hope there's a designated survivor if anything should goes wrong, because this is the group that could help figure out what to do. And when I think of the apex of that group, or the firsts among equals, I'm reminded actually of Ralph Nader, who became something bigger than any one company or movement or institution. He's just Ralph Nader, and was the guy who, while the title of his path-breaking paper was Unsafe at Any Speed, he wasn't anti-car. He was just anti-death car. And I think that spirit is a lot of what infuses a lot of the work here. And I think of Kate and Meredith as kind of the Ralph Naders of this space, bigger than any one institution, even than Google or Microsoft, respectively, and looking so much forward to the leadership they're going to continue to bring as we sort through what are genuinely incredibly difficult problems. If they weren't that difficult, we wouldn't need the lanyards that we're looking to make progress on. And the fact that I suspect none of us has the answer yet is a wonderful, exciting challenge rather than a depressing, let's just go home.
Yes. So with that pre-thanks, thank you, and off with the show with Kate and Meredith.
Thank you, guys.
When we have a microphone. Thank you so much, Jonathan and Joey, for that incredibly generous and I think somewhat illuminating introduction. I've never thought of us as the Ralph Naders. As researchers, we tend to go way nerdier than that, but we'll take it. First of all, a giant welcome to you. My name is Kate Crawford. This is Meredith Whittaker. We will be your co-chairs for today. And I want to know who here is feeling very excited about this discussion. Put up your hand, because I know a lot of you have flown a long way to be here, and we're incredibly excited to have you. If you look around, you'll actually notice that it is an incredibly diverse room today. That is by design. It's something that we think that the AI research field needs a lot more of. And you're here specifically, thank you. You are here because your work has inspired us. That's why you've been invited. You've been doing this work for years. There are a lot of people who have been thinking about the social impacts of artificial intelligence, and it is our pleasure to bring you together for the second annual AI Now Experts Workshop. So when we think about artificial intelligence, and you've absolutely heard what we would agree with, which is that there is no fixed definition, we have to talk about a multitude of things. We need to talk about technical modalities like machine learning, neural nets, natural language processing. We also need to talk about the industry itself, which is highly concentrated with around 7 players in the world who are really doing AI at scale, depending how you count. We also need to think about the diverse communities who are being affected very differently by these technologies already, and that is happening now, not in some science fiction future. And we also need to think about the way that AI is already proliferating through criminal justice, healthcare, education, access to credit, and hiring. And so these are some of the sorts of topics we're going to be dealing with today. And in order to understand the full picture, we're going to be calling on all of you. We're also going to need people with very strong technical domain knowledge. And if you look, you'll see a lot of those in the room today. But we also urgently need other perspectives. We need historians to let us know how we got here. We need legal thinkers to help us understand the potential impacts on the justice system. And we're also going to need ethnographers and economists to map the changes to labor, workplaces, and well-being, and policymakers and members of civil society to help turn that research into action. We also need to expand the definition of AI research to include all of these types of practices and disciplines. But let's be clear, AI isn't everything. And the marketing hype will try to tell you that, and we're really going to push back on that today. We want to keep a very critical lens around exactly where AI should be, and it's not going to be everywhere. We have to think about where it's going to be best applied and where it shouldn't be applied. So that's about enough for me. I'm going to throw now to my co-chair, Meredith Whittaker, for you.
Thank you, Kate. Ms. Nader, please. So a year ago, many of you were here for the first AI Now Experts Workshop. And back then, we didn't know this would be an annual event. But the discussion in that room was so vibrant, and it continued on after the event. And of course, we realized there was so much work to be done that we decided, hey, let's make it yearly. So we're here again for the second annual AI Now Experts Workshop because we want to nurture this work, because we want to build and strengthen this community. Today, we are going to focus on 4 core domains. And these are those that were mapped out in the AI Now 2017 draft report that you all received before the event. To refresh, these are AI in relation to rights and liberties, issues of bias and inclusion, labor and automation, and ethics and governance. This report was intended to ground you all in these topics, and you'll notice many of your work was cited in there. But now that we're in the room, we want to kind of build on that discussion. We want to hear from you. How are these issues touching your domain? What are the next steps that this field needs to do to address these tough questions? And how do we get there together? So before we start in on that, just a quick grounding in our schedule. You have an agenda in front of you or in the bag you were given, and here is a rough outline of the day. So the day is divided into roughly 2 parts. There is the in the morning, we have lightning talks from a number of experts across these 4 domains. And that's going to be kind of the input section, if you will. We will then break for lunch, and that's when the people on the live stream are going to be saying goodbye, and we will return for a closed-door, candid group discussion where we really want to talk about what are the next steps from your perspective, concretely to begin to address these challenges. We'll wrap up at around 4, and you will have time outside with some refreshments to meet people, to collaborate on projects, to scheme for the next steps. And then we ask you to be back here at 5:30 for the symposium, the public symposium, where you all have VIP seats. Following which, we really want you to join us for the VIP cocktail reception, which will happen right outside where we're having lunch. So, a quick note on guidelines and logistics. If you walk out the door, go down the hall on your right, that's where the bathrooms are. And if you have any questions on how things are working, if you need any help, a phone charger, what have you, Emily here is handling all logistics. So here is Emily.
That's
Ask
Emily.
her. She is our valiant helper on all things. Great. And so that's it for me. I'm going to turn it to Kate for a few guidelines, and then we're going to get started.
Beautiful. So before we kick off, a quick request to you. We're going to ask you to do 2 things today. The first is, during each of these blocks of lightning talks, you're going to be hearing very different disciplinary perspectives, but we'd like you to listen for the threads that join them together, and possibly also the gaps. Where are the things that should be here that are not here yet? So if you could sort of think in those sort of syncretic ways as we go through these lightning talks, that would be fantastic, and we would love to hear that from you. Secondly, during the group discussion in the afternoon, we're going to be asking you to provide essentially very concrete steps forward. That's in terms of research agendas. That's in terms of things that industry can do. What are the concrete actions that industry should be taking? And then thirdly, what are some productive advocacy and activism paths that could address some of these issues as well? So they're the top 3 for you to be thinking about in the afternoon session. Now, if you have a look, we've also given you a bunch of Post-its and pens. This is here as a sort of aid memoir, because you're going to be hearing a lot of interesting, very new research. As you have questions and ideas, use that. Jot them down. But also write clearly, because we're going to be collecting them at the end of the break and then at lunch, and that's going to help also guide that group discussion this afternoon. So know that those pieces of paper are very important, but the occasional doodle is also happily appreciated. So feel free to draw as well. That is basically enough from me. What we're going to be doing now is kicking off our very first block of lightning talks. This is an area which has become incredibly populated just in the last year. A lot of very exciting papers looking specifically at the problematic area of bias, machine learning, and inclusion. So to kick that off, our very first speaker is going to be Joy Buolamwini from the MIT Media Lab. Joy, over to you.
Good morning, good morning. I'm Joy, poet of code and the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League. Today I'm going to present the undersampled majority. And so my path into AI starts with computer vision, with a look at facial detection and recognition software. I've had the experience of coding in a white mask or borrowing somebody else's lighter face to be detected, and so that led my exploration into why. And so looking at where we've come with facial recognition, I go back to 2014, where Facebook released DeepFace, which increased the state-of-the-art by 27 percentage points. We were really excited, and we tracked this using the LFW benchmark. But my question was, how representative is this benchmark? And are we getting a false sense of progress based on skews within these benchmarks? So researchers in 2014 looked at the breakdown of LFW labeled faces in the wild and found that it was 77% male and 83.5% white. And so I'm thinking, maybe this is why my face wasn't being detected so well. And we know that with data-centric technology, data is destiny. So the question is, how fair is our fate? So then I looked at the latest government benchmarks released in 2015, and these benchmarks were described as being the most geographically diverse. So I thought, why not check? When I took a look at the benchmarks, I looked not just at gender, but also phenotypic representation. And so I labeled the faces using the Fitzpatrick type with 6 points, lighter skin to darker skin. And here's the breakdown. As far as gender parity, we're close to where we were back in 2007, right? Still at 75% male. And then when you look at the representation phenotypically, we're at 80% lighter skin. I decided to take it one step further and do an intersectional breakdown, which I hadn't really seen much of in any of the papers I'd encountered. And the reason I wanted to do the intersectional breakdown is we don't have disaggregated metrics when we look at the performance. We get 97.5%, right, doing well on LFW, but what does that really mean for subgroup populations? When it comes to the government benchmark, this is what I saw when I did the intersectional breakdown. You see that the majority of this government data set that's used to benchmark for the industry is 60% lighter males and only 4.4% darker females. And when you consider people of color make up 27% of the US population, so you would expect at least 13 if we're doing it just based on representation, this is not okay. So our fate is fair when it comes to pigmentation, but this definitely is not where we need to stay. We can't have data sets that are mainly male and pale. And when we talk about diversity, increasing gender diversity is great, but we also need to think about phenotypic diversity as well moving forward. And one way to do this is to think about full spectrum inclusion. So this is the Jabolski map, which shows the skin type representation around the world. And we can see it is not 80% pale, and of course the world is roughly 50-50. So this is part of the work of the Algorithmic Justice League, looking at how we can create more inclusive benchmarks so we have a realistic view of where we are, because if we have data that's largely male and pale, we're going to fail at being inclusive and intersectional moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have Moritz Hart, who will be talking up next. Thanks, Moritz.
All right, thanks so much for inviting me. This is by far the most well-organized workshop I've ever seen. Certainly much better than the ones I've organized. So I want to talk about biases beyond observation. And the starting point for my talk is the insight that really most fairness criteria that people have discussed in recent years are what I call observational. And what is an example of an observational criterion? It's something like the fraction of accepted men should be equal to the fraction of accepted women. Okay, so the rate of acceptance by some classifier should be the same in these two groups. Okay, that's observational, which means you can write it down as a probability that involves only like the sensitive attribute and the predictor and some other stuff. And really, this is most of the things we discuss. For example, the COMPAS debate that was ongoing last year and is still going on to some extent. Everything that was said there is essentially an observational property, okay? Things like false positive rates by different groups, things like precision, recall, accuracy. If you look at all these classification measures by group or whatever you want, that's an observational criterion because you can write it as a probability involving all these different things, okay? So really most of what we've discussed in fairness to this day is observational. Okay, so you can put that in a nice definition, which is just an observational criterion is a property of the joint distribution of the features in your classification setting, the predictor, and the outcome. So really anything you can write down as a probability. So you might say, well, geez, isn't that everything? And so let me tell you why it's not and why it's actually missing important things. So the issue with observational is that it's completely passive. Okay, so it's completely passive inference from what we observe. and the way the world is right now, at this point in time, and the observations we can make about the existing world. But there is no form of intervention in this kind of analysis. There is no what-if consideration. What if I changed this? What would happen? How would we change the world based on these interventions? It's purely passive. And that's why it's such a limited approach. And so with my collaborators, Eric Price and Nati Srebro, we turned this into sort of a theorem by constructing two different worlds, two different scenarios, which map to the same joint distribution over features, outcome, and predictor, but have completely different interpretations for fairness. Okay, so they're completely different worlds from the perspective of fairness and how we should reason about these worlds, but they map to identical joint distributions. And that's one way of showing that no observational criterion in the world is going to tell them apart. No matter how sophisticated your probability statement that you're going to make, it's not going to tell these two worlds apart. Okay? It's just not powerful enough. And what's even more troubling is the following simple thing we show. It's that observational criteria can't even tell you if you should be happy with the optimal predictor. So if you're in a setting and you ask, well, is optimal prediction fine? Would we be happy with a perfectly accurate predictor in this setting? Observational criteria can't even tell you if the answer is yes or no. Because in the two worlds we construct, in one case the perfect predictor is something most people would be fine with, and in the other case it's not. Okay? So we're not the first to stumble into this issue of observational criteria. People have, struggled with this for a long time, and it is what motivated, causal reasoning. And Judea Pearl's book, for example, on causal reasoning is all about how do you go beyond observational criteria. Okay, so people have studied this in other contexts. What's tricky in fairness is that we can't just design a randomized trial based on, race or gender. That's not feasible. So we need to instead understand the data and the generating process of the data and make reliable assumptions about how the data was created and generated. Okay? And if we have those assumptions, then we can start to go beyond the limits of observational, and we can have more meaningful criteria. But of course, that's a delicate approach, and we started working that out a little bit in a recent paper with folks from the Max Planck Institute in Tübingen. But there's much to be done here, and it's not easy. But at the very least, one thing that I advocate for the community as a step forward is let's stop to try to resolve which fairness criterion everybody should use, the sort of one definition that we should all agree to. And let's instead understand the mechanical or the mechanisms behind the data and how it's generated. Let's understand how the data was produced from the point of measurement, collection, to sampling. How did we get to the data that we're looking at? And if we understand the mechanisms behind the data generating process, we can start to make progress. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Moritz, for that, I think, really important provocation for the day. Next up, we have Solon Brokus from Cornell University.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that, Kate. And I think I'll hopefully build quite nicely on the previous two talks. So there is, in fact, a considerable amount of work that's been going on for the past few years on developing fair machine learning techniques. And what I'll try to talk about today is what problem are these actually solving? So clearly, you've already heard that standard problem here might be that the models we build are not accurate. Maybe they're sort of haphazardly not accurate. Maybe they just don't do a very good job. And maybe any error is seen as being problematic. But really, what often tends to be the case, and what has been the focus of a lot of the work, is these disparities in the accuracy rates along the lines of things like gender or race, right? And so maybe that's what we want to attend to. We want to make sure that there's equal accuracy across groups. But what we learn, actually, from the work on the COMPAS score is that it's not maybe enough to actually focus on accuracy. Maybe you have to go a bit further and focus on the difference in the types of errors that are made when there's a mistake. Is it a type 1 error, meaning a false positive, or is it a false negative? And how do those differ by group, especially when the consequences of the errors differ? But then we also might talk about biased training data, as we kind of heard earlier this morning already, where the problem here is that it's not just that the accuracy rates might differ, but that the evaluation techniques we use don't even tell you that you're going to do badly. We're actually, I think, in a situation like this. Oops. Yep. Sorry. where really what we're concerned with is unrecognized errors. So not just that the accuracy rate might differ, but that we have no way of even knowing what the real accuracy rate of these things will be in practice. And similarly, we can imagine a situation where it's not just that there's a bias in the way we collect the data, but that the data actually encodes past discrimination. So let's imagine we want to use machine learning for hiring decisions. We use previous employee performance to figure out who in the future would be a good person to hire. And let's imagine that we're using, let's say, their annual review at the, to try and train this model. Who gets a high annual review score? Well, let's imagine in this first case that the annual review process is somehow influenced by either conscious prejudice or implicit bias, so that these scores don't reflect the actual performance of employees, but rather the kind of judgment made by humans, which then becomes the training data for these models. And so you can imagine that, again, in a way, this is a problem of unrecognized errors, where the machine is going to predict that this person won't perform terribly well, but the reason for that is the score that we've trained them on is actually misrepresenting what past people were actually able to do. But let me complicate the story a little bit and imagine a slightly different situation where the workplace that these people might actually spend their days can be hostile, can be very unwelcoming to certain people, can make them feel like they're not part of a team or they're not giving them more desirable jobs, such that the actual objective measure of their performance might be a faithful reflection of how they did under those circumstances. But it would be hard to argue that building a model using that data would be fair, because in a way it's suggesting that that person is responsible for not performing particularly well. And so what we might want to consider is, how do you actually make accurate predictions when the circumstances themselves are unfair? Actually, along the lines, I think, of what Moritz was saying. So this all kind of leads to, I think, a focus on questions about these background conditions, what the status quo is, that really we shouldn't take as something that is not available for us to change, right? So these predictions don't actually consider what we can do about the rest of the environment to make those predictions actually no longer valid, that are actually probably the more desirable point of intervention. And if we begin to think that way, if we begin to say that it's not appropriate to make predictions based on the experience of people working in a hostile work environment, you might also want to ask about the longer-term consequences of being subject to unfair disadvantage. So the point at which people arrive at some important decision being made by machine learning, they've already been subject to all sorts of injustice, such that by just looking at them at that moment in time, it may seem entirely fair to make a decision about them on that criteria, and the prediction might even be accurate. But it would be it would be under conditions where you've accepted as a given the kind of cumulative disadvantage and injustice this person has suffered up until that point. And so what I would just want to say is that I think there's a really important problem here, that we want to make sure that, yes, we are predicting accurately, but we also want to ask whether these tools and techniques are a mechanism to remedy past injustice more broadly. And I think in approaching both these problems, there are dangers. So one certainly is that if we're going to use fair machine learning as a way to rectify historical injustice, there's an implicit sort of property here that it can be a kind of mechanism for affirmative action, and to do this under the cloak of something that's sort of broadly called fair machine learning, I think runs some serious risks, especially when it becomes exposed as being something along these lines. And similarly, I think there's a real danger here of sort of certifying decision-making as being fair when the conditions under which those decisions are being made remain deeply unfair, and that we don't want to use machine learning just as a way to continue the status quo. So thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Solon. I think we're starting to see the threads already emerge in this group. For our final talk, we have Simone Brown from the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks, Simone.
Good morning. A quick Google... There we go. A quick Google image search of the term artificial intelligence, we come up with photos of humanoids like this, iRobot-looking images of white plastic faces that seemingly stare out into the distance, into nowhere. But these representational practices are important for how artificial intelligence is marketed and imagined and sold to the public. But in the 1930s, a curious link was made between robots, an electrical company named Westinghouse, minstrel imagery, and the history of black people's labor in the United States. Designed by Philip Thomas and Samuel Kintner from Westinghouse Research Laboratories, this robot, sometimes called Mr. Rastus robot, sometimes called the mechanical slave, and sometimes called the mechanical Negro, had dark rubber skin, was dressed in denim overalls, and wore a checked bandana around his neck. An aesthetic gesture, perhaps, to the southern working-class African-American farmers, as both raw denim and checked cotton have a history of being labeled as Negro cloth, or an apparel of enslaved people who were required to wear nothing finer. Negro cloth laws in this way sought to establish a sartorial link between those that can labor unfreely and those that can wear finery. So Mr. Rastus, the mechanical Negro, was a black robot that was introduced around the time of the Great Depression, invoked perhaps to soothe concerns around robots replacing human workers. But unlike Westinghouse's other robots of the time, this robot was a symbol of black servitude. And the racial meanings attached to this mechanical slave, as Louis Chude Soki notes in his book, The Sound of Culture, was perhaps to lessen the fear of the uncanny that these technologies represented. So when this realistic mechanical Negro first appeared at the National Electric and Light Association conference in San Francisco in 1930, it was kind of as a sideshow. It was part of Westinghouse's robots as marketing strategy for its various household technologies and other innovations. Rastus could bow, say a few pre-recorded words, and he had one major trick. He was made to enact the legend of William Tell. His inventor would aim an arrow at an apple that was sat upon his head, and a light that was at the end of the arrow would activate a photoelectric cell in Mr. Rastus's eye, and the apple would explode. It was quite a violent display. So the name Rastus is part of this roster of depictions of blackness that are often exaggerated representation that took the shape of figurines, kitchen utensils, postcards, lawn ornaments, and that also adorned the boxes of the instant food industry. And these exaggerated representational practices work to rationalize the economic exploitation of black domestic workers, as well as those who labored in low-paying conditions in the service sector. So Rastus, the mechanical slave, is one story, an old story, but one of many that can get us to think about what the afterlife of slavery can teach us about artificial intelligence and our inhumane presence. Oh, sorry, I meant to say inhuman. There is seemingly a certain historical continuity when it comes to what data becomes training data and who is in the room overseeing that training. For example, with this case that I'm sure that you all know about from 2015. So 2 points to wrap up. First, we must contend with our historical presence. And second, these technologies are not infallible. For example, the case of pattern and object recognition or determination. With the case of whistleblower Ronaldo Chavez of the Albuquerque PD, who testified in a sworn affidavit for a case that there are back doors, that these patterns and objects can be manipulated. He had testified that using Axiom's evidence.com storage of police camera footage, that he was able to, change perhaps a pen into a knife, or basically Photoshop items that come from a police camera footage. And so I would just leave with this question to close as what are our alternatives when these possibilities are there, and that we have to contend with our historical present. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone. Please come and join us here on the stalls, all the speakers. You're invited to come back now for Q&A. We have Joy, Moritz, Solon, Simone. Just little spots for you here. And thank you, Simone, for ending on such an important historical note. And I hope you're now enjoying this combination of technical and sociological and historical perspectives on bias. And I think it also really helps us start to question some of the somewhat more simple perspectives that bias is a thing that can just be removed or neutralized in data sets and machine learning systems. It's got a lot more complex than that, and there's a very deep history for us to contend with. So now we want to open the floor to you. This is your chance for questions. Great to see that Kathy's got one right off the bat. We have mic runners who are going to bring you mics. So as you think of them, please raise your hands and we'll have people come to you. First up, we have Kathy O'Neill.
Hi, wonderful guys. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm really fascinated by your discussion, Moritz, about how we don't have enough information if we just look at probability distributions. And this is something that has come to me in a sort of backdoor way, which is that I feel like instead of talking about probability distribution, we should talk about the use case, the moral use cases. And I'm wondering if that is the lens through. And it's also the side effect of that is it's very understandable to people. Like once you explain, here's the moral issue in this context, here's the moral. If you have like an encyclopedia of like 100 different use cases, I feel like maybe that's the way to do it. What would you think?
Yeah, so it's on. Okay, thanks for the question. It's something I would, certainly think about as well. And I think tying fairness to use cases is very important. I think we should probably move from this kind of abstract discussion of fairness properties to understanding the task that we're trying to solve and sort of what our objective is and what our goals are. And so I think that ties into it, but I think it's not the only issue. We also need to understand better where the data came from and what sort of how it was measured, how it was generated, sampled, and so on. And what interventions we might be able to make to change the data that we have and get. Yeah, if you make that part of the use case, I completely agree with you. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from Arvind Narayanan up the back.
Solon made the point that sometimes what we call fair machine learning can be seen as unacknowledged affirmative action. And I found that very interesting, very provocative. I'd never thought about that before. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit in a couple of ways. Do you see this as an occasional problem, or is much of what we're talking about fall under this umbrella? Are there any examples you can give just a little bit more intuition on that?
Yeah, thanks, Arvind. I think what I was trying to suggest is that many of the problems that fairness in machine learning has tried to address are ultimately reducible to questions of accuracy. And there are going to be circumstances, though, when that's not the case. And so if the reason, for instance, the data reflects that certain people perform better on the job than others, is that they were actually subject to discriminatory treatment in the workplace itself, sort of what is the data generating mechanism in that case? We might want to say that that's not an appropriate basis to then assess future people about their performance, even if it might mean that under those circumstances, they would go on to perform less well than others. So I think the idea then is if we compensate for that in some way by saying we should actually imagine how they would perform under better circumstances, under more acceptable or desirable circumstances, one thing that might happen is something along the lines of, providing some kind of boost for people who otherwise would not be assessed as favorably given current circumstances.
Thanks. We have a question here up the back.
Hi, yeah, thanks for your great talks. There was a bit of a theme of biased data sets, and I really like the way Joy put it as skewed data sets. I thought that was very good wording. I'm wondering, I guess for all of you, does an unbiased data set exist, or is there some kind of approach to collecting data sets that would handle removing skew in some way, or is that sort of a fake ideal? I'm curious what you guys think.
As far as an unbiased data set, that I have not come across, and as long as human hands are involved in curating our data, there will be some type of bias, and maybe that bias is to positive effect depending on the context in which you're using it. I think what we need to do is move away from bias eradication to bias awareness, and again, a contextual understanding in terms of how the data is being used. So in the case of benchmarks, we shouldn't be in a situation where we look at a single metric and delude ourselves into thinking we've made progress when you look back at the data and the skews themselves are not representative of target populations if you're looking at a national set or internationally. That's why I talk about the undersampled majority, which is not represented in this room.
Just add very briefly, I think that's a very important point I want to underline that you make, that we should move away from bias eradication to awareness. And an example I like to give is genomic data or DNA. It'd be really hard to remove ancestry information or a sort of correlation with race from the DNA. And so I think we should first understand what are we going to do with the data and what is the task we're trying to solve. And then it's easier to talk about this issue.
We have a question here from Rob Sparrow, and then over here to Timnit.
So I guess I'm worried that the emphasis on fairness as accuracy misses the element of fairness as process and the ways in which the process might itself shape outcomes. If you imagine a workplace review process, for instance, the dialogue that might occur in those cases itself can shape outcomes in interesting ways. So I guess I'm worried about the framing here as, you know, taking a data set and producing an outcome and the only criteria is accuracy. I mean, are there ways of representing that question about the nature of the process itself as socially transformative in this problematic?
I'd love to hear what Simone and Solon have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly take the point. I mean, what I guess I would say is that so much of existing law and policy is focused on process, and what is actually somewhat interesting and different about some of this recent work is that it's given us a way to think a bit more than about process itself. However, I think what I was trying to suggest is along the lines of what you were also saying, which is that if everything is reduced ultimately to a problem of accuracy, we will not get at a lot of the much more fundamental institutional problems that we want to address, and that those actually require intervention into the process, into procedure. And so we really do want to think about what other things we can put in place besides some technical mechanism at the point of decision-making that will actually really transform how these institutions function.
And I think for me, a question is more about the right of refusal for these, facial recognition technologies or so. So who are the communities that these technologies are often tested on first? People who can't refuse, often people crossing borders, people who are claiming refugee status, students, prisoners, people who are on social assistance. And so those are often the testing grounds of these technologies. So rather than think about how can we make these less biased or quote-unquote unbiased, it's thinking about the social conditions of where these technologies are applied and what are the technologies, that kind of tactical resistance and maybe a politics of resistance that we can also talk about rather than, making a better machine.
Thank you. Timnit over here, and then a question here from Heather Roth.
Hi, thanks for the great talks. I had a question for Moritz. I kind of agree with Kathy, where she said that we should take the use case into account, because for me, I was actually thinking about this research question. I do think we should model the data, for sure, like the underlying process of the data. But what I would want in my head is some knob to say, if, I have external knowledge about how this, data could have been biased, for example, in the criminal justice case, it would be extreme policing, in certain communities, then I would want to know how that would affect my outcome in some way, right? So I wouldn't assume that I know exactly how the data was generated. If there's some uncertainty in there, like it probably was generated this way or that way, then I'd want a knob to adjust it. And then another one was just a comment that we're talking about machine learning algorithms outputs being accuracy. But I think right now in the AI community, we're also working on a lot of other stuff. Like we're trying to make machines that reason. We're working on visual question answering. And I think in that case, this question of fairness becomes even more complicated and more important. So I think the accuracy case is probably like the simplest possible case we can think about. But then in the future, I can think of all sorts of other cases that are more complicated.
Yeah, so your first point is something that is excellent, and I completely agree with. So I don't have anything to add to that. I think we should totally do that. The second point, I also strongly agree with, and I think people are trying to apply machine learning to a lot of scenarios where we don't have a good measure of accuracy even, or we don't have our criteria of what's a good solution are very subjective. And that's in a whole other can of worms where it's much harder to say anything reasonable. But in some sense there, the failure point is even earlier when we use machine learning, and we should maybe not use machine learning for all things like beauty contests or something. That's not something we should be doing. And so machine learning should not be used for everything. And I think we should start with very well-defined settings where we have a lot of control on what we want to measure.
Excellent. For our final question, Heather Roth.
I think it segues in quite well. So when we're thinking about, data, and so you mentioned the beauty contest, right? This is a social, political, cultural thing. And so, in the social sciences, I'm going to make a plug for the social sciences and the humanities here, right? I think one of the things that we do, at least as political scientists, is we attempt to do random sampling of populations to ensure that you are getting a representative sample. And from what I've heard in this room and what I continue to hear when we talk about data generation and where we get data and how we get data, is there's no random sampling here, right? It's so beyond random. So one of the things about the skewed data is maybe part of the fairness solution is actually to re-skew the data towards randomness, rather than looking at, okay, so I'm getting data from policing and refugees, and that population looks significantly different than the rest of the population of the world, and so maybe what I need to do is intervene to re-skew towards random. So maybe that's a way towards fairness, a la Rob's point, but again, even that assumes a particular viewpoint of fairness that is itself culturally biased. So I would kind of want to throw that Western kind of fair thing happening in the discussion.
A great provocation. Final comments from the group before we move on to our next set.
I think the point on putting in a skew is interesting in terms of what we do for intentionality when it comes to curation, acknowledging that the majority of our data sets we have right now are based on convenient sampling. And so that's something I continue to explore. And another part I definitely want to focus on is when it comes to phenotype. This is something that I haven't seen much research on, at least when you're looking within automated facial analysis. When we only look at demographics, we forget about the intra-class variation. So I'll leave it at that, but that's something I've been thinking about.
This was a fantastic set of talks that spoke very closely to each other. Thank you so much, everyone on the BIAS panel. We'll ask you to take your seats now, and we are going to now have our next group, which is going to be on labor and automation. A huge round of applause for our speakers. Thank you. Meredith.
Great. So now we have researchers and policymakers who are going to examine issues of labor, jobs, AI, and our systems of resource distribution. So remember to keep writing your questions down on those Post-its. We're going to collect those at the break and at lunch. And I want to give a warm welcome to Andy Stern.
So I think if there's one lesson that I have learned in my life, it's this. Let me go back. It is that change is inevitable. It's actually progress that's optional, and leadership, which is why we're all here, I think can really make a difference right now. And so let me explain. I'll start with my perspective on AI and technological change and jobs and work, which comes out of a long journey I took for 3 years trying to understand the future of work. And I came away with this very simple perspective, that there is the potential, and the emphasis is potential, on the greatest disruption of jobs in the history of the world. And that's not just an overstatement or my thinking. I think that if you kind of look at all the reputable research we now see coming out, and you can add to this Oxford and McKinsey and many of the other technological leaders of our country and business leaders and academics, I think it's becoming quite apparent that something big is going on in terms of jobs and work as we move forward. And when they did a poll of 1,896 Pew experts, I thought what was interesting is that half of the experts, which is obviously a very large number, thought that there's a possibility of masses of people who are effectively unemployable and actually breakdowns in the social order. And when I met with Andy Grove along this journey, I mean, this is the thing that he said to me that I think is really important for today's thinking, is that we are, I think, at a strategic inflection point. These are moments of significant change. They often appear slowly, not clear until events are viewed in retrospect. And denial, which I think is what's happening about jobs and work, is present. And that is, I think, the status quo as we exist now, at least amongst our political leadership. So what do we do? So I draw my wisdom from a great American philosopher, Groucho Marx, who says, while money can't buy happiness, it certainly lets you choose your own form of misery. And from a great moral leader, Martin Luther King, who talked about the simplest approach to ending poverty, and I would say economic stability, is actually a universal basic income or a guaranteed income, which is actually what I've spent my time thinking about, giving every single adult American $1,000 a month, allowing them to make their own choices, providing economic stability for them and their family, and allowing people to figure out what are their needs, purposes, and opportunities in their life. Now, I appreciate there are a million questions about it. People ask about how much does it cost, and is it politically feasible, and who should actually get it, and should you have to work, and what does it mean about purpose and meaning in life, which is why a number of us have created the Economic Security Project, which is trying to do what AI Now is doing in this space, to really experiment with the idea of cash transfers, to do the necessary research, as one of many scenarios. Because I think the most important thing we need to understand is that we don't need to have a debate about the future to figure out who's right or wrong. Any more than when Kim Jong-un says he's going to launch a weapon, we don't debate will he or won't he and what will Donald Trump do, but with rigor and intelligence, our military and academic people in the security industry figure out scenarios. And universal basic income, to me, is a scenario that we need to do. And for all of our highfalutin thinking about strategy and how we can make these change, I sort of end with what Milton Friedman said, that only a crisis produces real change. And what happens in a crisis is that people that have good, well-developed ideas lying around often find themselves in the center of the ability to make change. And I think this is a moment where we need those well-developed ideas of change. I think universal basic income is that right idea. And as Winston Churchill said about democracy, you know, UBI is a terrible idea until you try everything else. And what's your idea? Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. And now I'd like to introduce to the stage Karen Levy from Cornell University. Approaching.
Okay. So, there's a lot of, as Andy highlighted, there's a bunch of well-founded concern lately about the economic impact of potentially massive job loss based on AI. A lot of people are worried about the possibility that millions of workers will find themselves without the means to provide for themselves in the way that they traditionally have. And there's a lot of economists really concerned about what we're going to do about that. There's a lot of concern as well about what sectors are most likely to be disrupted first. And a lot of people agree that a prime target for a really significant economic disruption is long-haul trucking. There are a bunch of reasons for this, some of which have to do with kind of the technical capacities around, like the huge innovation in autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles actually lend themselves really well to the style of driving that trucking entails. And then there's other factors, too, having to do with the nature of trucking work. Truckers, because of the way the industry is organized now, truck drivers get really tired. They're really overworked, and so they cause a lot of accidents on the road, which are expensive and deadly. And so there's a lot of interest kind of from the labor perspective, too, in finding ways to take these guys off the road, put robots in the cab. So this is like a really big concern. And a lot of the rhetoric is about this displacement, right? Like there are a lot of people really concerned about the fact that there are 2 million truck drivers in the United States. Many of you may have seen this graphic from NPR a couple years ago using Bureau of Labor Statistics data to show the most common job in every state. So you can see that those aqua states, the most common job in 2014 was truck driver. And so people are worried about, like, what does this mean, right, if there's massive job loss in this industry? Now, I think I've been studying technology and regulation in truck driving for about 6 years now. And I think this captures certainly a large part of the threat of automation to this sector. But what I want to talk about today is actually a different threat, which I think gets a lot less play. And I don't think that there's going to be a discrete phase transition. It doesn't go like human, 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 robot, right? Like not all of a sudden will there be this huge, massive displacement of workers. Instead, being a truck driver actually involves a bunch of different types of work that aren't driving. And those are harder to automate, at least harder to automate in the short term. These are things like loading and unloading freight, securing stuff to a truck, doing repairs, interfacing with customers, these types of things. Some of those we'll be able to automate in time, but we can't do it right away. And therefore, truckers are still going to be necessary. It's just that the nature of their work is going to change. And what we're going to ask them to do is coordinate and integrate their work with machines. Now, a lot of times people talk about like a handoff, like a passing of a baton between a human and a machine. But what we actually see happening in truck driving right now is not really a discrete parceling out of tasks. What we see instead is actually the integration of the human into the machine in a way that's very gradual and very physical and actually quite intimate. And I'm going to give you some examples of what I'm talking about. So this is a cartoon that was in a trucking publication a few months ago, showing like a slightly stylized but actually based on all real technologies, this image of the robo-trucker. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of these systems. So Mercedes recently announced that it's working on a vest for truck drivers that will monitor their heart rate and their vital signs. And if the driver is in danger of a heart attack, it will stop the truck immediately. This is a system called Seeing Machines, which uses a driver-facing camera to monitor a driver's eyelids. It detects if the driver's eyelids are closing or if the driver's starting to look away from the road. And if it does that, it alerts his boss. That's logged like in his record, and it's used as training data. And it also, this is the best part, it causes the driver's seat to vibrate. It kind of like gooses him back into attention. These drivers are wearing what's called the smart cap, which essentially is like constantly running an EEG to look at a driver's brainwaves in order to understand fatigue. So if you get tired, it'll sound an alarm. It can be configured to text your manager or even your family members. There are other systems too. Some companies use predictive analytics to predict whether or not a driver is at risk of being in a crash. And it'll use not only driving data, but also information about the driver's life, like if their pay rate has changed recently, if they've started their day later in the morning than they usually do, that sort of thing. And so the key point I want to make here in a few more remaining seconds is the distance between these two types of threat, right? So we hear a lot about this threat of displacement, right? This threat that there are no longer going to be truckers on the road and that's going to cause like tremendous tears to the social fabric. What we hear less of is this concomitant threat, which is that the nature of the work that remains is going to be really different, right? There's this displacement narrative, but then I think there's this kind of under-theorized narrative about intrusion, right? And about the way that AI is actually felt in this industry as this like really forced hybridization of human and machine. And that's what I wanted to highlight today. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. And now I'd like to welcome Jonathan Stern from McGill University.
Hi, everybody. Thanks to the host. Thanks to Elena Rozlogova at Concordia, my collaborator on this project. I'm going to talk about a small industry with a big impact on the sound of media that people hear, and that is audio mastering. So audio mastering used to mean literally making the master record that you could then stamp other records from. So it began as record cutting. But today you can think of it as something akin to typesetting. Many of you have published, right? So it's the moment where the manuscript begins to look like the book. And so the best way I can illustrate this is actually with the difference between an unmastered and a mastered audio track. So here's a little audio sample for you. Okay, that's unmastered. Here's mastered. Bigger, deeper, louder, wider, in short, finished. So for individual recordings, mastering is basically the process that makes them sound finished. For multiple recordings, it is the process that makes them conform to a single standard. And this is important for film, for gaming, for television, for music. So I've been looking at LANDR, a company that standardizes and applies machine learning to the mastering process, and they're pretty successful. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but I would say that it works pretty well. And the reason for this is fairly interesting, and that has to do with the structure of the mastering industry. Audio mastering is highly standardized. It is, in the parlance of science and technology studies, heavily black boxed, which is to say most people who use it don't really understand how it's done or how it works. And the industry itself is heavily stratified, so you have a few international experts, you have specialists within sub-industries like gaming or film or television or music, you have local specialists, and finally you have people who sort of can't afford professionals and do it themselves. So effectively, what Lander has done, and here's a picture of their web interface, is leveraged this black boxing, right? So there are very few options here. You can basically, you can low, medium, or high master, and you can compare your master and your original recording, and that's about it. And this actually isn't that different from the experience of most artists who have their work mastered, which is to say they send it off, the mastering engineer does stuff, sends it back to them, and they might say, can you change these one or two things? So Lander is a new company. I don't actually know if they're making money yet, but they are making a big splash in the audio mastering field. And it's important to several different constituencies and populations. The first is, and this is sort of the happy story of machine learning, is through automation they've made it much cheaper, and so many people that don't have access or didn't have access to audio mastering now do. So for instance, one big community that uses a lot of Lander's services is independent hip-hop producers. So in a way, this is an interesting converse of what Joy and Simone were talking about before in terms of access and presence in machine learning-based media. But there's also the case that another group that's very interested in services like this are video game industry and Hollywood studios, where for a game or a film you're talking about hundreds of different audio files that all need to be mastered quickly and efficiently. And so this is a place where potentially machine learning could replace specialists. And the last place where I really see this having an impact is not at the top of the industry, but the local independent mastering engineers, who are often the very people training these algorithms, who are employed by small labels whose margins themselves, record labels whose own margins have gotten smaller and smaller and are looking for ways to cut costs. In terms of other implications, this is pretty standard stuff, but the thing I would point out is that more and more machine learning is creeping into these areas that shape the sound, the look, the feel, you could say the aesthetics of media. And with labor, then, comes a sort of not just people working for not just people working to make media sound, feel, and look like they do, but the decisions behind those things are increasingly being automated and being transformed. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And now up to the stage, Stephanie Dick from the University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much, Meredith and Kate. So at least as early as the 19th century, pioneers of mechanical calculation imagined that we might be able to one day build machines that would automate or take over human mental labor in the same way that factory automation and industrialization at the time was taking over certain kinds of human physical labor. And that vision is in some ways being borne out today as increasingly elements of cognitive labor, knowledge construction, problem solving, calculation, modeling, tasks that once belonged to the variously trained heads and hands of human beings are performed increasingly by automated systems. But as historians of computing have shown time and again, and as we've just heard from Karen, computers seldom simply replace people in the performance of a given task, but rather through automation, tasks are reimagined. They are transformed so as to accommodate or to capitalize on the affordances of the machines that we have built. And these transformations, especially where cognitive labor is concerned, often have really significant epistemological stakes. And that's what I would like to point to today. And because I'm a historian, I'll offer a historical example that comes from the early history of a field called automated reasoning that sought to introduce computers to mathematical theorem proving and mathematical problem solving. The example poses the question, what is it that we know exactly when cognitive labor gets automated in different ways? Where is that knowledge situated? Who knows it and how? So in the beginning, in the 1950s and the early 1960s, automated reasoning was imagined overwhelmingly in anthropomorphic terms. Practitioners imagined what kinds of contributions computers might be able to make to mathematical problem solving as measured against the different kinds of contributions that people make. So for some, they thought that one day computers would become just like human mathematicians. They could be colleagues or mentors or coworkers. Others were less optimistic, imagining the computer would be more like a graduate student and would be in need of significant guidance. Still yet others, in the tradition we heard from Simone about this morning, people used the language of servitude and slavery to talk about the kinds of contributions they thought computers would be able to make, specifically that they would do repeated menial tasks primarily. And through each of these anthropomorphic imaginaries, practitioners partitioned the work of mathematical problem solving and distributed it differently among humans and computers perceived as having different capacities or training. And in so doing, they also valued and devalued, humanized and dehumanized certain forms of cognitive labor. But this was only in the beginning. The anthropomorphic language of the field changed somewhat during the second half of the 20th century, as many practitioners wondered what forms of reasoning or problem solving computers might be capable of that were utterly unlike their human counterparts. Here, for example, is a quote from John Allen Robinson in 1965, who imagined remaking our very idea of reasoning and the logics that capture it with computers in mind rather than people. Traditionally, he writes, a single step in deduction has been required for pragmatic and psychological reasons to be simple enough to be apprehended as correct by a human being in a single intellectual act. When the agent carrying out the application of an inference principle is a modern machine, the traditional limitation on the complexity of inference principles is no longer very appropriate. More powerful principles become a possibility. So Robinson is most famous for what's called the resolution paper, principle, which he introduced in this same paper, which was intended to be one of these computer-oriented, more combinatorially powerful principles. So rules like the syllogism, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, is meant to be obviously correct to us. Whether it is or it isn't is another question, but it is meant to be apprehended as correct in a single intellectual act, in his words. Resolution permits, on the other hand, more complicated inferences from the premises, all hounds howl at night. Anyone who has cats will not have any mice. Light sleepers do not have anything which howls at night. John has either a cat or a hound. We can infer with resolution that if John is a light sleeper, then John does not have any mice. This is, albeit a very baby prose example that's not actually that hard to work out, but it gives you the sense that resolution is a different kind of inference rule, not designed to be immediately apparent to us. And accordingly, resolution-based proofs and solutions were not and are not easy to unpack, to understand, to read and follow all the way through, if indeed that's even possible. But resolution was very powerful. Resolution took over automated reasoning. Resolution-based systems have been used to solve open problems in mathematics. They've been ported into industry to solve any number of problems. It is an exciting and a powerful vision, but it also has a number of critics. Those who believe that the human exemplar, human understanding and modes of reasoning ought not be dismissed so quickly because they fear that our understanding and our agency is dismissed along with it. They fear that such demonstrations can show us that something is the case, but not why. And I think the epistemological concerns raised by that kind of critique should stay with us as artificial intelligence systems move their way throughout many parts of our social world, not just mathematics. Thank you.
That was excellent. And Stephanie, if you can just stay up here, we're going to have a quick question and answer. Andy, Jonathan, Karen, if you could join us. Again, extra points for people who can thread the connections through these themes. There are a number of them, so great. So do I see any hands? All right. Let's go to Glenn over here. And then Molly.
So connecting what Karen and Andy talked about and to the theme of AI now rather than in the future, recently I did a calculation that Walmart pays out about 40% of its market capitalization in wages every year to various types of workers, while Facebook and Google pay about 1% to 2% of their market capitalizations out every year. So putting aside anything in the future, there is an AI now question of why these industries have perhaps the lowest labor share of any industries except for a few extractive ones in history, and what to do about that at present. And I wonder whether any of you might speak to that.
I mean, it seems to me that's just the nature of the business, as they say, that it's scalable, it requires low levels of input to get high levels of value. And I think this is just a redistribution question. You know, I don't think we can retool the business. I think the question is whether it's the Microsoft robot tax or any other ideas that we have. I think this is more of a question not of changing business models, but redistributing success in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I would say for trucking, I think the potential of the move towards AI follows on a lot of other moves that are designed to try and reduce that proportion, right? So like a familiar one that a lot of us have thought about in other contexts is the move from employees to independent contractors, right? And so in many ways, this is seen as kind of like being another, like the motivation from the trucking side is definitely reducing those labor costs.
Great. So I think we had a question from Molly Steenson.
Hi, thanks. This also ties into the last session a little bit. One thing we see with anything that's data-oriented is an increase in visualization, right? We need to visualize the data in order to understand it. But what we also see is a step away from representation, right? So if we were considering Simone's talk in the last session, I think there's a question there of representation as opposed to visualization. I'm wondering two things. First, how do you see this taking place in the different case studies that you've given, whether mastering or truck driving or a history of mathematical reasoning in artificial intelligence, and whether something should be gained by representation or perhaps the opposite?
I think I'm not quite sure what you mean by representation and visualization, because to my mind, there are a number of visual modes that serve as modes of representation as well. So could you clarify what you mean by the two terms?
Right now, I'll speak in an analogous field. In architecture, there is what's been referred to as a crisis of representation. Art historians, humanities scholars, architectural historians have issues now with the notion of representation as opposed to visualization, right? So if we've now put all our eggs in a basket of visualization, what have we lost by representing?
Sure, so I guess I can say something about that. It's not just that under the hood, these more powerful, more computer-oriented modes of reasoning and problem-solving are hard to follow. They don't come out on the page in a way that you can publish in the same way, in the way that people can read and annotate in the same way. There has been a kind of displacement of forms of writing and symbol systems that are designed to be more accessible to human intellectual work. And that's certainly something that mathematicians are anxious about relative to increased automation. I don't know if that addresses your point, but it seems like a related problem.
I think it maybe also contributes. I have never thought about this in these terms before, but it's a really interesting question. I think it potentially contributes to the uncanniness of the experience of like hybridizing your body with AI in the way that truck drivers do, right? To feel known in this like really internal, visceral way that isn't visual, right? To like have it be based on signals from your body that you have like are not represented to you in any way, right? But to just like have the truck wake you up. Right, like I'm extrapolating because I haven't asked this question of people, but I would guess that maybe that ties into what's happening in architecture as well.
Great. So I think we had a question from David, then Blaise, then Rob.
Okay, so thanks very much for a sort of fascinating set of talks. I think my question is two related questions. One's about a group of workers who I think haven't got a huge amount of attention so far in looking at questions of automation. So tend to focus on kind of highly visible work like sort of manual labour and truck driving and those kind of things. There's a sector of workers in the sort of white-collar industry who've done basic administration effectively, and the enterprise IT industry, of which I'm a part, has basically spent most of decades trying to automate that work away. There's been a whole category of work that's been beyond the reach of traditional software engineering because it's required just enough judgment that you can't codify it in normal programming languages. That's now, through AI and machine learning solutions, becoming addressable. So I think there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of workers worldwide whose work can be addressed in that mode. And I must admit, for them, I don't see the kind of the collaboration, co-machine working. I think the work will just go away and become fully automated. So just wondering what your thoughts are on work that's being done to think about that sector. And then a related question. If you look at the press over the last few weeks and months and our experience of big cyber attacks and virus infections, the topic of resilience becomes ever more important. The good thing about humans is that they can, you can infect them with viruses, but not IT viruses, and they're kind of quite good at figuring out how to respond to crises. What do you see? Do you see the need for human-based resilience as a way of securing employment for that sector in the future?
I'll say something about the first part of that question, which is that I don't think machine learning is maybe it's a tipping point for certain kinds of white-collar labor and administration, but if you think about examples other than manual labor, corporations have been working to reduce the number of people involved in those for a long time. So we see, for instance, the laments about the disappearance of retail now as an example of that in relationship to mail order. But of course, retail shopping has probably for decades, although I don't have statistics on this, had fewer and fewer people working in stores, right? A big box store versus the corner hardware store, for instance. So it's a larger structural thing of which machine learning is a part, and that has to do with how companies think about their bottom lines, right? And that labor is seen as a cost that needs to be dealt with and gotten rid of rather than part of being a company is providing jobs for people, right? And so that leads you into questions of basic income and things like that. But I think in general, one of the reasons mastering works as a field that can be automated is precisely because most people sent their tracks away to be mastered. The attended mastering session where you were there with the engineer is a relatively rare thing in that industry, and that's why it works. So I think the fact that people have been taken away already makes it easier to automate these things.
Yeah, the number one job that Columbia Masters in Business used to get, the number two jobs were stock analysts on Wall Street and traders on Wall Street. Now there are no jobs.
Great. Yeah, and just to add to what Jonathan said, I think the automation in particular of administrative work and also of other kinds of sort of accounting and calculating is part of the longer history of mechanical calculation and automation. The earliest computers, of course, were constructed to replace the work of typically female human beings who were doing complicated calculations en masse on paper, and they were replaced by machines like ENIAC. So this gets back to Jonathan Zittrain's comment at the very beginning that we have to think about what we mean by AI when we pose these questions, because some of them are just related to the longer history of computing and mechanical calculation in general.
So we're running up against the clock, and we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to start lumping them together, and then maybe we can give thoughts on all of them. So we have Blaze, and then Rob, and then Fred. So we can go in that order and maybe try to keep it to one thought.
You just raised the question of labor and gender. And one of the interesting things about truck driving is that that's an overwhelmingly male profession. And that's true, according to BLS, of a lot of the jobs that are in imminent risk of being fully automated in the near future. You also raised the issue of instability, of social instability. A lot of male grievance, a lot of job elimination, social instability. Comments, please.
Yeah, so if we could just pass it to Rob over here and then keep that in mind.
So one thing I liked about the recent talks is you guys talked a little bit about sort of heterogeneity of effects, right? So we heard about truck drivers and how maybe the effects are going to be different for long-haul drivers versus short-haul drivers. The nice example of the mastering and how there's sort of maybe going to be different effects for high-end mastering versus low-end mastering, right? I feel like to a certain extent that's been missing from the conversation. We talk about sort of these bigger issues that we think are going to happen, these sort of bigger effects we think are going to happen. There tends to be a very negative, in my view, sort of overly negative view about things that will happen, and we sort of miss perhaps some of the positive benefits. And so I feel like you guys were sort of talking about that a little bit. We got 2 great case studies. I feel like it would be great if we had sort of more systematic evidence about what was happening or what is happening across different industries and even within industries or occupations, sort of across different types of those jobs, different types of those occupations. So I'd just love to hear some thoughts on that.
And then, Fred, if you want to.
So the first automation struggles that I know about are from the late 50s and the early 60s. And in that period, as now, there's a terrible fear that automated beings will suddenly sort of take everything over. The robots will come, they will wipe us out, they will take away our jobs. I was struck that the stories that you were telling across the panel were stories of a more frog-like slow boil, where automation occurs slowly and in relation to people's lives, and it's as much a process of integration as it is a process of overcoming, of overrunning. My question is, if we understand it as a process of integration, what might we learn from the close work that a number of you are doing that would allow us to speak back to and change the top-down robots are coming debate?
Great. So take your pick.
I mean, I would say there's, lots of evidence across the board. We can do more studies and should, about this constant downward pressure on jobs and income both. We see it in the labor participation. We see it in the opioid crisis. We see it at many different levels, but we don't sort of want to recognize it because we have 4.4% unemployment and every president wants to tell you that, happy days are coming. And so I just think we really need to focus on the huge implications, of getting this wrong, because every previous economic revolution, even when more jobs came, had 20 to 50 years of pain for people that we could avoid.
I'll just say 2 quick things in response to Blaise and Fred. First, in terms of gender, I actually have a whole paper about this that I can send you, but very broadly speaking, certainly the fact that truck drivers bind their masculinity up in their work and in the mechanical equipment, there's a lot to be said about the role of masculinity in that job specifically, resistance to authority and resistance, autonomy and freedom and all that kind of stuff, sexual freedom, that helps me to understand why this is perceived as a threat not only to their ability to provide economically but also to themselves. And then in response to Fred, I don't actually have a great answer, but I have an answer that I think would be the wrong answer that I would caution against, which is that I think the easy thing to do would be to dismiss these stories of oh, here's what's actually happening now as being kind of this short term, oh, well, yeah, this is what's happening for 5 years, but once there's no more truck driver, then who cares? That sucked for 5 years and then now it's over. But I think that would be a fallacy, right? In part because there's always going to be a person, right? In part because, if we're interested in AI now and the ethical and social and political implications now, then, obviously that's an inadequate answer. And also in part because, to the extent that data is being drawn from these systems now, if you have really unwilling participants, participants who are trying to thwart the systems at every turn, which they do, then, you're getting bad data, right? So even if you don't care about the people as people or about the dignity of work, you might care about this as a technical problem.
I will also say one brief thing to Blaise and to Fred.
I know you care.
I would like to say that, of course, there is a ton of women's labor that is also being automated. Certain areas like in caregiving for the elderly, the education of young people, department store work, and secretarial and administrative work, which have typically been gendered female. There's huge investment and work being done to automate that kind of work as well. There's also more investment in female-gendered android bodies than male-gendered ones. You don't see robots that look like men doing the work of men in factories, but you do see robots that are made to look like women doing the job of a receptionist in a hotel, for example. So there are differences to note. There's certainly the automation of a lot of female gendered labor taking place. To Fred, of course, I gave one example that I hoped raised something that I have actually seen in a number of different places, this anxiety that automated systems may be able to show us that something is the case but not why. That's a story that covers the entire history of this field of automated reasoning that I'm writing a book about, but it also, I think, attaches to debates today about interpretability and non-interpretability of machine learning systems. There's a debate between Peter Norvig and Noam Chomsky that raises a number of the same issues. So although it was just a case study, I think it is indicative of a larger epistemological set of questions that accompany the introduction of these automated tools.
And I guess I get to go last. Rob, I agree, more systematic knowledge is good. I don't like the sort of good-bad sort of dichotomy, though, and this also goes to Fred's point. The way people generally talk about tech industry stuff is in impact language, as if it's somehow outside of society. Technology companies, like all institutions, are cultural institutions. They're political spaces. They're fraught with the inequalities of the broader society. And even when we talk about things like basic income, we need these sort of broader systemic understandings of power and inequality. So in a way, the answer is the same as it was in the 80s and 90s, which is we need to get beyond this sort of this new iPhone is going to change my life, this new machine learning algorithm is going to change everything, and instead actually look at the people and the institutions and the regulations that are often bumping up against one another.
Great. That was fabulous. And I saw a few more hands, but unfortunately we are running up against time and we are a tightly timed conference. So we're going to let you go to break. Please be in your seats by 11:50. We're going to start promptly with the rights and liberties section. And before you dismiss, just a quick plug. Outside you will see what we're calling our interactive wall. You can't have a tech-related conference without one. And it asks the question, what is the most urgent thing this community needs to do in the next 12 months? So we have Post-its there. If you have ideas, provocations, thoughts, share them. We're going to think of this as kind of a time capsule for next year. So have your break, be back in your seats. We'll get started with rights and liberties, then ethics and governance after that. And thank you so much to our speakers. That was fabulous.
If you can hear us, clap twice.
If you can hear us, keep clapping.
Now we're waking you up. We're getting you in. That worked. All right, everybody. I just want to say, first of all, again, a giant thank you to all of our speakers this morning. It was spectacular, the scope and scale of ideas that are necessary for these discussions were just brought so beautifully and elegantly. So we're about to get more. You'll notice we had very relaxing music for you as you were walking in. That's because this is going to be the rights and liberties section, and there's going to be some quite sometimes stressful, sometimes confronting things that we have to think about. So we also just want to say we're really liking some of the notes that you've been taking, and we've been looking at those. It's prepping us already for what's going to be an amazing discussion this afternoon. So keep it up. Remember, that's what the Post-its are there for. So keep them coming. They're fantastic. So right now we're going to kick off with rights and liberties. And if I just turn to my beautiful program, our very first speaker is going to be Sarah Brain from UT Austin, who's going to be talking about her incredibly important ethnographic work looking at predictive policing and the LAPD. Thank you, Sarah.
Great. So I am a sociologist, and I study how the police use big data. As Kate mentioned, I spent a couple of years doing fieldwork with the Los Angeles Police Department, and in many ways, they're a department that's sort of on the front lines of the use of big data and predictive analytics. This is a photo I took inside the Real-Time Crime Analysis Center, which is kind of like the Situation Room in downtown LA. So today I'm going to talk about two kinds of data-driven surveillance. The first is dragnet surveillance, and the second is directed surveillance. So dragnet surveillance refers to tools that gather information on everyone rather than merely individuals under suspicion. One example of a dragnet surveillance tool is the automatic license plate reader, or ALPR. So ALPRs are cameras that are mounted on top of cop cars, and there's some static cameras at intersections or other locations, and they take two photos of every car that passes through their line of vision, one of the vehicle, one of the license plate, and then it records the time, date, and geo-coordinates. So dragnet surveillance tools like automatic license plate readers mean that increasingly individuals who have no direct police contact are integrated into the law enforcement corpus. So in that sense, dragnet surveillance tools represent sort of a proliferation of what can be understood as pre-warrant surveillance. So it makes possible everyday mass surveillance at this unprecedented scale. Pre-crime data can be mined for links once criminal suspicion comes into play, and once in a database, law enforcement can retroactively search and model ALPR data rather than only starting to gather information on an individual once they come under suspicion. This means that information is routinely accumulated and files are laying in wait. So directed surveillance, by contrast, is focused on individuals who are under criminal suspicion. One example of directed surveillance would be algorithmic policing. We've probably all heard a fair bit about location-based predictive policing, where historical crime data is inputted into an algorithm, and then that predicts where and when future crime is likely to occur. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about person-based predictive policing. So person-based predictive policing is premised on this idea that a small proportion of violent players are disproportionately responsible for the majority of violent crime. Therefore, focusing police resources on these individuals will have a large impact on reducing crime rates. So in a division in the LAPD, they use a point system in which individuals get 5 points if they're on parole or probation, 5 points if they have a prior arrest with a handgun, 5 points if they are in the gang database, and then 5 points for a violent criminal history. After that, individuals get 1 point for every police contact. So the cops stop you and talk to you, that's a point. Quantified policing, in that sense, can easily become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It generates a feedback loop whereby an individual having a high points value is predictive of them being stopped, and then they're stopped, and that thus increases their points value. In that sense, mathematized police practices can place individuals who are already under suspicion under new and deeper forms of surveillance, while appearing to be objective, or in the words of one captain I interviewed, just math. Just because directed surveillance is focused on individuals who are under criminal suspicion doesn't mean that they're the only ones involved. So this is a network diagram I had an employee at Palantir Technologies make for me based on a network diagram I obtained from someone in the LAPD. This person in the middle, this like Carmen Sandiego person, is someone with direct police contact. Radiating out from that individual are all types of entities that he or she is related to. It could be other people, phone numbers, cars, and then on the lines, I'm not sure if you can see, it indicates how they are related. So by being the lover of the person under suspicion, cohabiting with, or on a cell phone, for example. Now, to be in what I call this secondary surveillance network, you don't need to have any direct police contact. You just need to have a social network tie to the individual of interest. Any one new surveillance technology on its own might not be particularly consequential, but the combinatorial power of using the person-based point system in conjunction with automatic license plate reader data, in conjunction with network models, can grant authorities a level of insight into individuals' lives that would historically have constituted a Fourth Amendment search and thus required a warrant. However, because no one of those surveillance practices falls outside the parameters of the law in isolation, neither does their combination. By using a series of data points, or what I call digital traces, to automate the reconstruction of an individual's intentions and behaviors, whether incriminating or exculpatory, this lies or rests on the assumption of an infallible state and of actors who enter data and search databases without error or prejudice. So I want us all to think about the digital traces we leave. How are you leading an incriminating life?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sarah. Really important work. Now we have Patrick Ball from the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you. And my clicker is here. Got it. Data's always lying. And here's some data, and I'm going to tell you how it's lying. So I get to show the first graph at the conference. I find that very exciting. And I also get to talk about the first concrete algorithm. This is a really tricky one. We're going to draw a line through the points. We're going to draw a line through the points. It's going to be transformative. We're going to use someone's height to predict their weight. It's pretty exciting stuff. Now, this brings up the notion of data. And here's a bunch of data. I found it online. It's very big data, very, very big, very, very big. Hundreds of thousands of people combined, height and weight measurements that I plotted a line through. And that gives us a way to understand what we mean by a model. The training data plus the algorithm gives us a model. And in this case, we have a trivial model that we can describe in 7th grade algebra, that weight equals minus 122.6 plus 3.5 times someone's height in inches gives you their weight in pounds. Now, this is a great model, and I'm going to show you how great it is by showing you a line drawn through points that I didn't show the model beforehand. And look at that line. It goes right through those points. Will someone please call Wired Magazine this minute? We are displacing the entire industry of scales. We are transforming fashion, fitness. All right, calm down. This is called an out-of-sample prediction, and it is considered by most machine learning practitioners the way you test the model. You've got data that you didn't show the model, you put your algorithm, let your model draw the line through it, and you see how good a fit you've got. And this notion of it being a quality control measure is both completely correct, it's accurate, but it's also absurdly optimistic. It's absurdly optimistic because we randomly drew these points from the same data set we used to train the model. And here's where it all gets really tricky. Because, oops, what about those guys? Well, it turns out, I'm really sorry. Forgot to tell you. The data I trained the model on was of Hong Kong school children. And these red points are Major League Baseball players. Turns out, not the same. Turns out, I could have used a different model. But because I didn't know that, because I didn't get out of my chair and go and look at the data in the real world, I just took a data set that came to me by some automated data generation mechanism, I felt really good about my model. And I just made claims about it. And not only did I make claims about it, if I made sufficiently powerful claims, people may have made policy on that basis. And we would have kind of blown it for all these other people. So, how bad can it be, right? Maybe we just put a caveat on it. We say, no, don't worry about it. It can't be that bad. No, it actually wasn't even all that great a model for the Hong Kong school children, because it turns out that when you ask people to opt into a study, people who love their weight and are really happy about it opt right in and hop up on the scale, and you get the blue dots and you draw a line through them. People who are self-conscious about their weight opt out. And so you get a whole cloud of people who you don't observe. And now you have a model that's really for not just Hong Kong school children, but the fit and thinner Hong Kong school children, not for everybody else. So what is this model doing? Well, the model is telling us the relationship among the variables we can observe and that we have observed. It is not telling us other things. So what are the points that were unlikely to be observed? What did we miss? And are we selling ourselves, or as the proponent of this model, selling us a caveat fantasy? And I sometimes go back and forth. Is it a fantasy? Well, that's the self-delusion part. Is it a fallacy when we're selling it to someone else? This is the fallacy in which we say, well, our model only applies to this part of the world, as though we know what that subpart is. Whenever someone says, well, okay, our model doesn't do that, but it does this, how do we actually even know it does that? How can we define that if we don't know what we're missing in the training data? If we don't know what the data excludes, we don't know what the caveat should be. And by the way, does anyone even remember their caveat by the time they get to the conclusion? No. It's only on the first page. By the time you get to the end of the page, we're selling it as though we were pitching a Wired magazine reporter. So we all have to use these things, but we should be very, very careful about their limitations. And finally, this was mentioned in a couple of the previous talks, and I think it's worth highlighting. Is there a feedback loop between the process of observation and the way the model works? Does the model then teach us something that we then use to take some action which generates new data that we put back into the model? This is particularly problematic, I think, in predictive policing and risk-based modeling in criminal justice context. My colleagues and I have a couple of studies about this, but it occurs in a number of other areas as well, and Kathy's done a bunch of work on this as well. It's really important. How do these feedback loops then distort what we understand from the model itself? And so let me leave you with some conclusions. Let's stop talking about algorithms and talk about models, because once we talk about models, we enable the conversation about the data that trained the model. All algorithms in the same kind of classification are going to do essentially the same thing. Let's not worry about that. And so let's also stop talking about big data, because big data that's not necessarily more representative actually tends to increase our certainty in the wrong answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Next up, we have Ryan Calo, University of Washington Tech Policy Lab.
Thank you. All right. Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'm a law professor. I think I might be the only law professor on this morning's program. And the Legal Academy doesn't tend to place a lot of emphasis on method. It's a kind of something that we're having a discussion about ongoing. But cyber law itself, or technology law, has a species of an unstated one. And what we do is we essentially take a new technology, we try to define it, we try to place emphasis on what's really novel and how it's different. We then think about how it changes human affordances, like the people's actual and perceived capabilities in the world. And then we go through the law and we look for legal or policy assumptions that no longer obtain in light of this change. And then we make recommendations for how to restore the previous state of affairs, right? And that's a sort of a method that we use. So applied to artificial intelligence, hard to define, of course, a set of techniques aimed at getting machines to sort of usefully approximate thinking. What does it do? It spots patterns we can't spot. It solves problems differently. It reacts faster, and so forth. Presents a lot of challenges for law and policy. I like a recent example of a paper I like in this vein is Andrea Roth, who writes about machine testimony. You can't challenge a machine witness the same way as you can a person in a trial. Then there's all kinds of recommendations about what to do about it. So the problem of you can't have recommendations or explanations of neural nets, people say we've got to introduce transparency, conduct audits, spot test, software verification, and so forth. So I don't disagree with this method, and it's often what I think of myself as basically doing. But as Kate Crawford and I have written, we can't lose sight of the broader context. Some technologies, and I think AI is one of them, constitute an invitation to take a kind of societal inventory, not just for holes in the doctrine, but for our common values. We might ask not just how do we keep our existing rights intact in this crazy new world, but why do we have these particular rights? Are there guiding principles that ought to fall away, that don't make sense anymore? Are there promises that we can finally keep that we've never been able to before, like the idea that you have a speedy criminal trial? And if we keep those promises, does it come at the expense of other promises like that trials be public? And finally, are there new values and rights that are as novel to us today as privacy was to the common law at the turn of the 19th century? As we perform this exercise, I think it's important to look at the system as a system. For those of you who are Game of Thrones fans, either the books or the... You guys remember the scene where Ned Stark is like, makes this judgment, and then he's got to be the one to hold the sword and execute, right? He says something like, the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Well, in one of my favorite law review articles, Violence in the Word by Robert Cover, Cover argues that the whole system, the whole legal system, exists in many ways to sever the connection between the person who makes a decision and those who met out that justice. And I think we should be thinking about whether it is a good thing to further remove the judge from the execution, as I suspect artificial intelligence might. So I intend to do work on creating a kind of inventory of values in the coming year as part of a 3-year project at the Tech Policy Lab around artificial intelligence and law and policy. And in doing so, I want to draw from deep experts, much deeper than I, in administrative, criminal, and civil procedure, as well as people like you who are doing work exploring the design of fair systems. So I hope that you will please get in touch should that's something that you want to work on. Now, I realize, of course, that no discipline has a monopoly on values like fairness or justice or equality. I'm going to start with the law because, as I said, I'm a law professor, right? That said, I think law is a good place to start. Not only have jurists been thinking about these issues, like how to balance fairness and efficiency in decision-making for hundreds and hundreds of years, but also, historically, law has had a monopoly on coercion. So Robert Cover opens Violence in the Word, that article I mentioned, very memorably with the line, "Legal interpretation takes place on the field of pain and death." The idea being that these decisions matter. And the fact that AI is now helping to make them matters too. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ryan Calo. Next up, we have Lester Mackey, who's based right here in this town at Microsoft Research in New England. Thanks, Lester.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. So the question motivating my talk is how do we convince and equip the next generation of AI researchers to actually work on the pressing social problems of our time? And what I'd like to give you is an imperfect and biased answer to that question in the form of a story, with the hopes that all of you gathered here will come up with a better answer by the end of our time together. So this is a story of Statistics for Social Good. That's a volunteer working group at Stanford University of students, faculty, and researchers dedicated to promoting social good through effective data analysis. And the story begins in 2013 when I joined the faculty at Stanford and learned about this interesting summer program at the University of Chicago called Data Science for Social Good. Their goal was to train data scientists by having them work on actual problems of relevance to the government, the Chicago government, and nonprofits. And I thought, this is a fantastic idea. I'd love to contribute to something like this at Stanford. What can we do like this? Of course, I didn't really know how to get started, so with invoking my usual field bias, I sent out an email to other machine learning and statistics researchers asking them whether they could help me track down organizations and pressing social problems that could benefit from effective data analysis. About 20 people responded to that initial invitation. Most of them were computer scientists and statisticians like me. Most of them had zero experience working on social data problems. And in fact, a number of the students told me that they longed to work on these sorts of problems, but they never really knew how to get started. They'd never really encountered these problems in their classes. They didn't see people working on these problems in their fields, and so they felt that these were not really legitimate problems for AI researchers to be working on. What we ultimately decided to do was to take a divide and conquer approach to the problem-finding problem. Each of us was responsible for reaching out to a particular problem partner. This was an organization, a nonprofit, a government agency, a campus institution, even an individual expert who actually had the expertise to know what the pressing social problems were in his or her domain and to know how better data analysis could influence those problems. The hope for this was that we could learn from the problem partner what the pressing inferential questions were, what the relevant data sources were, and how we as outsiders with some data analysis skills could help them answer these questions in-house. Typically, at the end of a discussion, we would bring the information back to the complete group, the Statistics for Social Good group, form a team around some of the problems that were identified, and start a collaboration. And I should say that most of our cold calls and cold emails didn't go anywhere, but every so often we encountered the right group with the right problem that matched our knowledge and expertise, and that led to some interesting collaborations. So I'll just give you a couple of examples in the minutes that remain. The first is with a program called SparkPoint. It's started by the United Way of the Bay Area. These are centers that provide all sorts of services to low-income individuals to help them meet their financial goals. So they'll give you resume building advice. They'll help you open your first savings account. They'll teach you how to keep your credit score up. And they have very data-driven ways of keeping track of your progress. So they measure your credit scores, they measure your debt levels. Every time you walk into one of the centers, they will keep a record of that interaction. Every time you call or email, they have a record of that interaction. And so they came to us asking, for a given individual with a given target goal, what is the right bundle of services to provide, and in what order should we provide those services? And here's 8 years of data on what we did provide and what the outcomes were. A second example is with several organizations, several campus institutions at Stanford, as well as some partners in Denmark. The goal here was to design interventions for people who would incur large amounts of healthcare costs, but would be able to defer those healthcare costs if they were intervened with. So essentially the first step here was to develop a predictive model of which people were going to incur preventable healthcare costs. And again, we were able to work with a large data set, in this case of 2 million residents of the population of West Denmark from 2004 to 2011. And I'm giving you different examples to show just the variety of problems that we encountered. Each one was completely different. The process to getting to the right questions was completely different. This is to give you some food for thought about how we might organize these sorts of teaching experiences in the future. A third is with the Global Oncology Initiative. They are interested in investigating inequities in palliative care, and the very first step was essentially visualizing these inequities in palliative care. So we created for them an opioid atlas that you could go to. There's a link in the slides. And it essentially shows what countries have access to opioids, where's the demand, and where are the gaps. And one last example, this is one of the first projects we worked on, in fact. It was brought in by a master's student at Stanford who was very passionate about helping nonprofits. It's through an organization called Great Nonprofits, which is essentially a ratings database for nonprofits. It helps to match both individuals who are in need of care, people who would like to donate, and people who would like to donate their services, their time to these organizations, to find the right organizations for them. There was a prevailing hypothesis that those who were receiving services from an organization would not rate their organization poorly because they depended on those services, and we were able to debunk that hypothesis. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lester. And to bring us home, we have Nathaniel Raymond from the Harvard Humanitarian Institute. Nathaniel.
All right, this is cool because I feel like a contestant on The Price is Right, and that's always been a dream of mine. So who knows what PII is? Say it. Personally identifiable information. All right. Okay. Now, who knows what DII is? I thought so. Demographically identifiable information. And DII, not PII, is basically the fuel in the tank for AI. But we don't have a conception of how rights and ethics relate to DII. We actually don't even have, other than my book chapter in group privacy last year in Springer, which, we don't have an accepted definition of DII. But we're generating this type of new data, and we're using PII-based ethics, PII-based IRBs, PII-based readings of Belmont, Nuremberg, the Geneva Convention, to use this DII data with some of the most vulnerable people in the world in experimental ways with absolutely no oversight. So thus, my provocative but hopefully also precise title, Data Colonialism. And that phrase, it's very loaded, intentionally. And it came out of a moment I had last summer about this time. I was discussing Sean Martin McDonald's paper, Ebola Big Data Disaster. If you read one Ebola call detail records paper this year, make sure it's Sean Martin McDonald's Ebola Big Data Disaster. And I was responding to it at Data and Society, and I said, this is data colonialism. And then I got off the stage, and I'm like, what the hell does that mean? Besides being buzzword bingo. And I began with my team at the Signal Program on Human Security and Technology to try to unpack in the past year what that meant. And so we got to a definition of colonialism, meaning the imposition of unequal, often extra-legal, power relationships on one group by another. And in that sense, we are in a state because of DII. Because we haven't contended with DII, we hit a fork in the road, as they say where I'm from, and we took it. We haven't had an intentional process to think about how we retrofit our ethics and our rights for technologies such as AI that rely on DII. Based on an Instagram post by Meredith Whittaker, I was introduced to Ursula Franklin last year, and she said, the late great Ursula Franklin said, technology is the way you do anything. My provocation for you here is that rights and ethics are a technology. Stop thinking about them as separate from our stuff with the ones and the zeros, and as Elizabeth Bishop said, the bright objects that hypnotize the mind. Ethics and rights are actually prefacing protocols to use the other technology. So, in June of last year, I told my team, after the data colonialism mind, I said, okay, we're going to stop innovating. For 1 year, we're going to, Luke, turn off the computer, and we're going to step away from technology. And we're going to get back to basics, like AC/DC in the garage with the guitars, just turn it up to 10. And out of that process, we created the Signal Code. We spent 6 months reading all available rights and law, and we came down to the existence of 5 rights. The one I want to talk to you about in the last minute I have is right 4, data agency. And data agency, and thinking about that concept of data agency, was an attempt to apply existing rights and ethics to the concept of DII. And what does that mean? It means we have to go beyond informed consent. We have to begin thinking about what does informed notification, meaningfully informed notification, and meaningfully informed participation mean for communities. In my context, in humanitarian response and human rights documentation, we are engaging in non-consensual human experimentation on the most vulnerable people in the world on the worst day of their lives. That demands that we do more, and we start thinking of ethics and right as a technology equal to ones and zeros. Thank you.
Nathaniel, I'm going to invite you to the stage. If we could have all of the speakers back up here for a Q&A section. That was such an extraordinary breadth of topics, and what I really liked is that some of you who have spent a lot of time directly in the field, I'm thinking of you, Nathaniel and Patrick, working specifically in human rights contexts, are also bringing very sophisticated lenses to thinking about the data that has been generated there and where it succeeds, but also where it occasionally fails us. So again, I would ask you to raise your hands. Extra bonus points if your questions can connect some of these themes. We have 2 over here. I'm going to start with Jonathan and Jay-Z. I would also ask, we have Mira over here. We'll take those first 3 and then we'll come to you as we go. Oh, sorry, Danielle was first. Danielle was caught by the mic people before me, so she gets to go first, then Jonathan, then Jay-Z.
Man, what a great price of being forgotten. That's fabulous.
Never.
Okay.
You never.
I know, right? Love you, Kate. Okay. So it's there is absolutely a wonderful theme here, right? That the poverty of thinking about rights as individuated rights, as individual rights, and that we ought to understand the rights as collectives, right? So if we could understand this, Sarah, as you were talking about the right of the people, the sort of first couple of words of the Fourth Amendment, as collective rights, we might then, I think, be able to be imaginative and think about technologies of total surveillance, right, or dragnet surveillance, as you put so well. And Ryan, you're nudging us to think about values, right? The broader systemic values, not just on an individual level, right, but fairness, justice, equality, more broadly understood. And, you know, Nathaniel, your demographic, thinking about certainly the poverty of consent, that notion of consent in privacy law, it fails us when we think about demographic identifiable information. So I wonder now, well, what's next, right? How do we translate, and I don't mean to overlook Lester and Patrick, wonderful contributions, but maybe for all of us, how do we think about translating collective rights and giving them real meaning in this collective context?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And in terms of the distinction, I would sort of add a third dimension, which is that of networked rights. And so when we think about inclusion in different data systems, rights and risks are very different according to why people are modeled, right? So in the criminal justice context, of course, the probability of being included in those systems and your risk being modeled in those systems can have a lot of implications that might be different from those in other contexts, like marketing or advertising, for example. But Ryan, maybe you have more.
Obviously, there's in some instances a tension between individual rights and collective ones, and sometimes individuals are not best positioned to vindicate the collective rights. I mean, in one instance that may be familiar is that in the context of the Fourth Amendment, if you think about it, right, the people that are vindicating our Fourth Amendment rights are people who stand accused of a crime, and they are, their sort of raison d'etre is to get out of that crime, and as a consequence, people have argued that doesn't serve the whole public in terms of our ability to push back against the government, right? So there's definitely a tension there that I think it's important to think through. I mean, my point was maybe narrower, which is that, is something so radically different about artificial intelligence that there are certain rights that we could never have imagined granting to people, or ones that don't obtain anymore, right? And so that's something I think we should think through.
Yeah, and just to push off on that, I don't think there are new rights, but I think there are new hazards that we didn't imagine. And I think that the speed at which, through mosaic effect, PII can be weaponized into what the Marines call ABI, or action-based intelligence, also known as a kill chain. The same thing that we use DII for to do a good is the same thing that bad guys, taking from my context, what we use in Syria to do assessment is the same thing Assad can use to refine a double-tap barrel bomb, and may have done so. So the issue is that the kinetics, the velocity, the speed of decision-making, and the granularity of targeting is now entirely different. So it's not the rights that are different. We need to translate them to the collective, but need to do so within a theory of harm. And if we don't have a theory of harm, we're going to be left saying primum non nocere, first do no harm, without knowing what the harm is. And that's where we are now. So that's the biggie, is a theory of harm based on evidence we don't have.
Beautiful, thank you. We're getting a lot of questions for this panel, so I'm going to start taking two at a time. We have Jonathan and then Jay-Z.
It's great to be opening for Jay-Z. Okay. A comment and a question that go together. The thing that struck me about Lester's story, which is a great story, and I'm totally happy it happened, but that you'd have a bunch of machine learning researchers on a university campus saying, where could we find a bunch of people who define and think through social, ethical, and political problems and didn't think to look elsewhere on the university campus? To me, that's a sort of evidence of the continued sort of CP Snoke two cultures thing, except here we're really talking about humanities and social sciences and engineering. And that goes to the theme of coercion, which really runs across all the papers, which is to say that you have lots of machine learning practices that are extremely coercive in one way or another, often the people undertaking them don't even understand that they're being coercive. The police and the military might be exceptions. So basically, what do we do about that? Like, if the people practicing these things don't even understand that they're experimenting on vulnerable populations, that they are effectively coercing people, and, you know, whether the violence is legitimate or not, to use the Max Weber line about the state having a monopoly on legitimate violence, there's no question that private corporations systematically visit small violences on people every day. I mean, all this stuff about airline travel in the news recently is a great example of that. But you can think of countless ways in which the extraction of value, not only from workers but from customers, is tied to coercive practices. What do you do to build machine learning differently?
Wow. Epic question. I love it. Professor Zittrain, also known as Jay-Z.
Yes, I'd just like to start by apologizing to those on the live stream who were expecting Jay-Z. I thought one of the amazing things about this panel was the kind of kaleidoscope across it of modalities of gathering and storing and using mass data, from public to private to academic, and thinking that that might be a framework to realize, at least in the past, that we set up very different rules and expectations around it that may not make sense now. In the public zone, I think it gives rise to a question when I think of mass license plate surveillance, for example, which there are many, many reasons to be chary of that. It does bring into focus a question of whether getting a little bit of information on everyone to advance the solving of a crime or the preemption of something terrible may be less privacy intrusive than the more traditional, let's go to the usual suspects and really shake them down and get a warrant, and you've gone completely into their lives, and if it turns out they're innocent, it's like, we're sorry, you know, you can make your bed again, we'll just leave through the back door, and the one we came in on. And I think we owe an answer to that question. When is it okay and even salutary for all of us to suffer a little privacy intrusion rather than just a consistent few of us, possibly for some of the reasons brought up in the bias panel, doing a little bit? And on the private gathering front, when I compare it with academic, and I don't know, Nathaniel, how much of your warnings about the exploitation of populations are really only to academics. Stuff like the common rule, the limitations, the IRBs are only applying, as best I can tell, if you're pursuing the disclosure of general knowledge. And if Facebook is like, don't worry, we won't tell a soul, they pretty much get to do what they like and gather what they like, which creates its own asymmetries in who can do anything in the space. Yes. I'd love to figure out how to beat that. And finally,
Great.
There's probably P2P is another form of gathering this stuff peer-to-peer, neither academic nor public nor private. And I haven't begun to figure that out yet. Thanks.
Great. 2 important provocations, please. Patrick is bursting to tell us something, I can tell.
I am. I want to jump off of Jonathan's point and say one of the things about the doing technology for good, I live in San Francisco, so I hear this pretty much 4 or 5 times a day, is that it worries me that we don't have a notion of malpractice. Because what I worry about much more than the privacy intrusions which have governed this panel is that we as experts will tell our nonprofit partners something and we'll be wrong because we have done a crappy job, because we've used improper data, we haven't thought about the data, we haven't randomly sampled the data, we haven't tested it, and we'll tell them something that's wrong, they will rest their legitimacy on that claim, and then they will be discredited. And we will walk away having put it on our website. I'm not going to point any fingers like at Palantir, but I'm not going to... But we will have put it on our website, gotten credit for it, but nonetheless, our partners will have been harmed because we did crappy work. So I think we need to start talking about a notion of malpractice. But just to contradict that same point, I'd like to suggest that by creating limitations on the kinds of data we can collect in the space of trying to advance rights-based arguments, we can also destroy our foundation for those arguments. And some of the most powerful projects I've ever been a part of have been profiling projects. We've done these in El Salvador, in the Congo. We're doing them now in the United States with police, in which we track the perpetrators. We link the violations not from a victim-centered point of view, which is the way traditional human rights work has worked over the years, but rather through technological means, usually through like really fancy technology. Here I'm talking about SQL. We will link the violations databases to the perpetrator career structures and develop dossiers on the perpetrators that we can use for accountability.
Well, one day the Belgian ambassador who had funded the project was visiting us at the UN project in the Congo, and he was just admiring it and cooing, as donors often do. And I said, this would be illegal in Belgium, wouldn't it? And he looked at me and smiled and nodded. Right? So we should think about those asymmetries, because are there no abusive officers that we should be tracking in Europe? That does not strike me as correct.
Yeah, can I hop in, tag? Okay, so we got a lot to cover very quickly. So what Patrick's raising is the ethical principle of non-maleficence. So we talk a lot about beneficence, doing of good, maleficence, doing of intentional bad, but really you've hit it right on the head, is we don't have a concept of non-maleficence. What is the prevention of negligence, basically. And so what does that come down to is a fundamentally missing building block. And as someone who has been a perp tracker for my entire career, including with satellites, I totally agree. We don't want to limit the incredible role that data can play in making that case. And as someone who works in different times with ICC, critical evidence. That said, it's about duty of care and articulating that duty of care. So it's not about trying to say the line is here. It's about saying what are the constituent parts of a legal duty of care in this context. And it does come back to negligence prevention.
Excellent. We are now full of questions. Unfortunately, we'll have to hold it there, but I've scheduled you in. So if you've had your hand up, you are going to be in this set of blocks. The next person we have is Amanda, and then we're going to go to Mira.
Start thinking about the new hazards that might be posed by AI. But a theme that's emerged across all of the different talks this morning has been not that necessarily AI poses new harms, but the harms are in its power to exacerbate the indignities and intrusions that have always been imposed on sort of the same marginalized people. And we hear a lot in the AI context about race and gender, but I think the labor panel really brought to the forefront the other aspect, the interdisciplinary and also intersectional aspect of class. So my question is, when we think about it exacerbating these inequities by not just intensity, but also pervasiveness, and in the criminal justice context, the insidiousness, when we're thinking about rights and liberties, truly depriving people mechanically of rights, that there really should be a human who has to grapple with sending someone to prison or letting them out of prison, or what that actual human factor is. How do we think about whether solving these exacerbated inequities that are posed by AI actually solves other broader inequities that have always existed, but it's been easy to sort of put them off and kick them off to another day?
Great. So a really important question that I think also brings us back to the bias panel around what's the intervention here. And Mira, if we could add your question in as well.
Yep, sure. So this notion of consent is particularly important for me. This is the point at which a user says, yes, I am willing to give this exchange of data for a service. And most users don't end up reading terms of use. It's too much work. It's 12 pages long. I just hit yes and go on. So my question is, how do you guys think about going beyond informed consent when we can't even predict how that data may be used, and whether that data will be used to retarget a particular individual, or whether it will be used in some adjacent industry or category where that individual may not even benefit from the use of that data?
Great questions. Please, Ryan.
Yeah, so one of the things we think a lot about at the Tech Policy Lab is the problem that tech policy doesn't often reflect non-mainstream voices, right? So the idea is that tech policy reflects the mainstream. This is something we all know, but we don't really have a way to deal with it. So while law professors don't emphasize method, it turns out that my co-directors, like in information science and computer science and so forth, they're obsessed with it. And so we've come up with a methodology by which to incorporate non-mainstream or more diverse voices into tech policy. And what we do is we sort of make our best effort to create a product, like a white paper, and then we identify plausible non-mainstream stakeholders who will have thoughts about it, and then we give it to them and say, what's broken? And then we have a methodology by which to incorporate the feedback into the tech policy. And to Amanda's point, not only does this, hopefully in some Habermasian sense, make it more democratic and conclusive, but it dramatically improves the work product, even at the level of like technical definition. For example, very quickly, our technical definition of augmented reality said that augmented reality is where you basically add a layer of reality, you add information onto existing reality, and we ran it by a disability panel that said, actually, for us, often it will be substituting for a missing sense. And that actually then changed our policy recommendations. So, for example, we were saying, hey, maybe we can have a system where augmented reality turns off in sensitive areas like the boardroom or the bedroom or something like that, or the bathroom. But of course, we changed that conclusion because that would be to take away a reliance that a particular group had at a moment that they were most vulnerable, right? So this is not exactly responsive, but I think we need to develop methods like this. And we'll be publishing a long handbook on how we do the Diverse Voices project soon.
I think that consent question is an important one, and I'm hoping that we can circle back to that too later this afternoon. We're coming up on our last couple of minutes, but because we had such a long queue, what I'm going to do is allow the two more people just have very quick questions. If you can keep them short to the panel, and particularly if they have short answers, that would be fantastic. Mike Ananny, Heather Roth.
I'll take this one. Thanks very much. I'll try to be quick. I guess the one thing I wanted to put on the table, especially in a context of rights and liberties, is sort of the U.S. and American domination of notions of tensions between individual rights and collectivities, and especially around, I think we don't want to necessarily just look to the Fourth Amendment, or we don't want to look to American flavors of IRBs, because there's a much broader viewpoint. I'm thinking of sort of indigenous cultures, knowledge management practices around the world in a lot of different ways, and given that a lot of AI systems are sort of emerging from and dominated by American corporate entities, I just want to make sure we don't lose the idea that there's lots of different kinds of individual rights, not just a tension between individual and collectivity, and there's lots of different kinds of collectivity as well. So it's a rights colonialism as well as a data colonialism.
It's a great comment. Heather, last word.
Yeah, so on the idea that Patrick brought up about, kind of crappy data and you omitted variable bias. I'm wondering if, you said selection bias. I actually think it's an omitted variable bias. But I think what we're doing in a lot of this is what I've heard from out the panel to try to link everything, right, is what we're looking at is that we have these discussions of it's just math, right? It's just math. And as long as I put in numbers, I get out something that's going to be value neutral and completely not value loaded. And what I'm wondering is this because there is not just a bias in the data, like where we're selecting the data, but who we're actually selecting to process the data, that they don't actually understand that this is a social phenomenon, so it's a social science perspective.
Yeah.
And then is there a need as an intervention point to talk about research design from critical perspectives, and instead of just saying, okay, this is how you run your regression, this is how you build your algorithm, and actually saying, no, actually we have to start kind of questioning the positivist approach to it's just math.
I love that. And what I'm going to do is just give everyone on the panel one word on that, because I think it's really important. I want to begin with Sarah, because, of course, you've been studying how people look at these systems without necessarily thinking about where the data comes from.
Sure, yeah. So I think that the data analysis practices is really important. Just one super quick example is there's this one federal system where you can see how many times someone's name has been queried in a particular criminal justice database. And so when I asked a detective in robbery homicide, why would you want to know how many times somebody's name has been queried in a database? He said, just because you haven't been caught doesn't mean that you're not guilty. And so if you're not doing anything wrong, why would the cops be looking you up very many times over the course of your life?
That's a good one. Patrick.
I would distinguish I think it's really useful for us to distinguish really clearly between the use of models for prediction and the use of models for inference. When we're worried about inference, we care what the predictor variables mean, we care whether they're measured carefully, and we care what their weights are. And there, something like omitted variable bias is going to be really crucial, and we really care what they mean. If we're doing prediction, we actually may not care at all. And we may not care if it's completely arbitrary or badly measured. All we care about is the quality of the prediction. And in that case, that's when selection bias really becomes crucial, because at that point, if we haven't sampled the population that we intend to predict on correctly, our results are going to be wrong, and wrong in these curious and uneven ways. So I think it's useful to think about why we're building models in order to assess them.
Love it. Short responses from our last three panelists.
Very quickly, it's my intuition that there are very few interesting problems that can be resolved today by reference to any one discipline. And so, we need people in machine learning, we need people in statistics, we need people that do polling, who are obsessed with making sure that their samples are representative. And we need all those folks in dialogue with one another in order to solve these problems.
I think there seems to be a perception that not only is the answer to the question we care about just math, but it's also somehow magic. That is, given this data, you as a machine learning person should be able to answer any question that I have to ask, just given access to this single data set. And so one thing that we try to really emphasize when we work with our project partners is, this is the limit to the sort of inferential answer you can get out of the data you're giving us. Quite often, if someone has a causal question, they give us a data set that's purely observational, and they want to know what's going to happen in the future, and we tell them you can't actually answer that question given this data. Or, if you just give us a data set without any question, there's no good way to generally answer all, lucrative questions in the future.
I think we're at a pivotal moment, and we don't recognize how pivotal it is. And for those who've heard me talk before, you're going to yawn and say, oh, God, he's about to talk about the blue baby experiment. But after World War II at Johns Hopkins, there was the famous blue baby experiment, which led to heart surgery becoming a clinically accepted intervention. Before that, it was designated noli tangere, which means unhand them or do not touch. We are engaged in clinical and experimental without any clarity about what constitutes clinical artificial intelligence and what constitutes experimental. And thus, because we do not have a concept of unhand them or do not touch, we have no safety brake. We have no red button, and we have no bright lines. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying it's time for us to call things by the right names. And that is a process that involves everybody.
Beautiful. Thank you for that important final note. And thank you to the whole panel, if you could thank them all. And now you've made it to the last input session of the day, which is going to be ethics and governance. Meredith.
Indeed. So to be real about it, nothing we've spoken about doesn't touch ethics and governance. But right now we want to hit it on the nose. We want to get perspectives from across disciplines, history, art, philosophy, research, and just look at what are the limits and opportunities in our current definitions of ethics and governance. So I would like to welcome to the stage Molly Steenson from Carnegie Mellon University to get us started.
I have 57 slides. I have 5 minutes. Let's do this. So when we look at AI and we look in the media, we see a lot of things, like AI is the new black, AI is the new UI, AI is the new electricity. And we might also hear things like the future of computers is the mind of a toddler, if not a blue baby, or it might be a disembodied head. People like Elon Musk, we see him because tech moguls are declaring an era of artificial intelligence. And I am even AI. The Grid.ai is a web design company that offers AI services, and if you can read the small print, it's really offensive. Golan Levin had a really great thing to say about how awful it is. And I also have this slide similar to Simone, which is when you Google what AI is, this is what it looks like. But the thing is that AI isn't the new anything because AI isn't new. And if we look back to its history, we could look. There are some definitions of AI that even harken back to the first century AD. But if we look at where it began to develop after World War II in the 1940s and coming out of cybernetics, we see a number of things. It was John McCarthy who, of course, coined the term artificial intelligence in 1956, talking about making machines do things that would require intelligence if done by man. He convened a group of researchers at Dartmouth the summer of '56 to work on the agenda of what would be the platform of artificial intelligence. It was people including Marvin Minsky, Claude Shannon, Ross Ashby, of course, McCarthy himself, Frank Rosenblatt, Herb Simon, Alan Newell, and a number of others. These are still a lot of the platform of what we consider AI today. We talk a lot about learning when we're talking about AI, and notions of learning precede the coining of the terms. So Alan Turing in 1950 wrote about simulating a child's brain rather than starting with the brain of an adult, or looking at blank pages, thinking of blank pages in a journal that one might fill in. In 1952, when Arthur Samuel coined the term machine learning, and it was in order to look at simulations of things, if done by human beings or animals, would be described as involving the process of learning. How did he train it? Checkers. And just as an aside, the visuals in these articles are just unbelievably beautiful. Neural networks also have their start in this time period. In 1958, Frank Rosenblatt created the perceptron, and it unleashed a media storm. The New York Times wrote about it and said that it would be an electronic computer that experts predicted would be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. This is, of course, Navy funded. I'll get back to that in a second. This is something, though, that a decade later that Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert wanted to see an end be put to. They published a book called Perceptrons that argued that this line of research was effectively specious. They incorrectly proved perceptrons wrong, and as a result cut off funding to an entire area of connectionist AI for decades. They later issued an apology. And I want to point out that we are sitting in the legacy of artificial intelligence. Of course, with someone like Marvin Minsky, who co-founded the AI lab here at MIT in 1969. And of course, in the predecessor to the Media Lab, the Architecture Machine Group, which was founded by Nicholas Negroponte in 1967 and which folded into the Media Lab when it was founded in 1984. One of the things that the Architecture Machine Group did, it was a group of architects and electrical engineers who worked closely together, tinkered with technology, and built interfaces for artificial intelligence. One of the things they did is worked very closely within the same funding structures of the AI lab and AI directives, such as with the Seek show, or the Seek project at the software show. This is a Gerbils blocks world, a set of blocks, a stacking arm, a video eye that Seymour Papert and Marvin Minsky had invented, and a set of gerbils that did what gerbils do, which is make a mess. As Ted Nelson said about this, our bodies are hardware, our behavior software. Seek was a disaster in certain ways, not least because it killed the gerbils. There are other projects later on as the funding climate for AI changed, like Aspen Movie Map or Mapping by Yourself, which look familiar to us today and are actually picking up with command and control imperatives in the AI lab here at MIT at that time. I think that Nicholas Negroponte really understood what it was to be working with AI. In 1975, in his book, Soft Architecture Machines, he said that I strongly believe it is very important to play with these ideas scientifically and explore applications of machine intelligence that totter between being unbelievably oppressive, unimaginably oppressive, and unbelievably exciting. And this is about agendas, because these men set the agendas for AI. And this funding is a matter of defense funding. So someone like J.C.R. Licklider, whose notion of human-computer symbiosis was the operative idea for interactivity for decades, and still is. We could think of Karen Levy's talk earlier today. Someone like J.C.R. Licklider was Nicholas Negroponte's mentor, a professor here, the first director of the Information Processing Office, Information Processing Technology Office at DARPA, and also a private contractor with Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. Similarly, the Office of Naval Research funded the agenda for AI research, particularly through the vision of a man named Marvin Denikoff, who Marvin Minsky once referred to as the grand old man of AI. This is what Paul Edwards has called the closed world, the circulation between the military-industrial complex and keeping knowledge within a tight group of people who enjoyed working together, and funding. So what's at stake? AI isn't the new anything. But what's gained by saying that it is? AI is about building worlds. It's about modeling intelligence. In fact, it's about modeling ourselves. AI is about research funding, and it's about defense funding. It's about making new markets. It's about capital, and it's about power. The question here, I think, that we're all looking at today is, what do we want AI to be about? And what do we want its agenda to be? I'm tired of seeing, well, we missed her for a second. I'll bring her back. Although, we'll stick with Oprah. There are the cyborgs with jQuery across their faces. Everybody gets some machine learning. But I think what we need to be doing, and I think what we are doing here, is we're looking under the lid. We need to look back in time and open up the agendas, because AI needs us. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. It was an excellent 5-minute, 50-slide summary. So now I'd like to welcome to the stage Kate Darling from the MIT Media Lab.
Okay, so our prompt for these lightning talks today was, what is the key issue that we should be focusing our collective attention on right now? And I think that this community has done a really good job of voicing some of those issues. So I do want to use my 5 minutes to just throw something in that I don't think is a major problem, but I think is maybe an additional challenge that we are facing in AI governance. And that is the challenge of public perception. So, as you all know, there is an incredible amount of hype right now in the AI space. And you can tell that there is because people in even tangentially related fields have all changed their Twitter bios to have the word AI in them. And the media is all over it. I mean, everyone wants to talk about AI right now. And that's really great. It's really great that it's getting so much public attention. But compared to other technologies like, say, cryptocurrencies, I think that people, with cryptocurrency, people have a hard time wrapping their mind around, what this actually is. But with AI, we don't have that problem. We all know how to imagine AI because we've had this concept for a long time, and we've had it in particular in science fiction and pop culture, right? These supercomputers that get really smart and that have human characteristics and that might become self-aware at some point. And it's not that people are stupid and don't know that that is not complete accurate depiction of what's going on today. But I think it's really unhelpful for all of us that we have this cartoonish image in the background of all of our conversations about AI. And in some ways, it's worse than not understanding the technology at all. Because I really get the sense that people tend to overestimate or even underestimate the capabilities of current AI based on their sci-fi understanding of it. And this fear or fascination with creating human-level intelligence is, I think, as Kate and others have pointed out, really distracting us from some of the issues that we need to be focusing on right now. And some of the experts in the field are not actually helping with this. So this is an actual quote from a well-known AI scientist who's not here today, describing to the public how DeepMind's DQN system learned to play Atari video games. It was like a newborn baby opening its eyes for the first time. And then he says, so if your baby did that, woke up the first day in the hospital, and by the end of the day it was beating all the doctors at Atari video games, you'd be pretty terrified. That's not helpful. Okay? People are already weird enough about how we perceive these systems. You don't need to encourage the anthropomorphism even further. We are suckers for ascribing life to these machines. And we also do other things, like we think they're better than they actually are. We trust that algorithms aren't biased and that they're neutral, whereas we've heard today many times over that they are actually not. Also, Madeline Ellish and Tim Wang have done work showing that we trust these systems, and if there's a human in the loop and a mistake happens, we will assign more blame to the human than to the system. And we're also starting to see companies effectively distance themselves just a little bit from responsibility for certain outcomes by saying, oh, the algorithm did it. So we're still trying to recognize and understand all of the irrational ways that people over-rely on these systems and trust them too much or trust them too little, and why. But the main point I want to make here is that the flawed ways that we think about and project onto AI can actually affect governance. So people like Ryan Calo or Neil Richards and Bill Smart have all made the case that the ways that judges, for example, in the legal system understand and view robotic technology, for example, comparing robots to humans, has a real impact on court decisions and on lawmaking and leads to some very problematic outcomes that are hypocritical and don't make any sense. So it may be important to try to understand the irrational ways in which people view and treat algorithmic decision-making and the impact of that on the public discourse. So we need to recognize, for example, that we are biased towards anthropomorphizing these systems in our perception, in our language, and we need to be vigilant about these biases, and we need to try to focus the public attention on questions that matter. And we also need to be transparent about the actual capabilities of the technology and translate this knowledge for the general public and for policymakers. And so I'm just really thankful to be here today in a room full of people who aren't only doing great and really interesting and important work, but who are also intellectually honest and really care about getting the now and the future of artificial intelligence right. Thank you.
Amen, Kate. I would now like to welcome to the stage Rob Sparrow from Monash University.
So I believe that amongst the challenges raised by AI now are a philosophical challenge and a political challenge, and I'll try to say a little bit about each and how I think they're connected. The philosophical challenge is to better understand the nature of ethics, and in particular, what it means to talk about ethical AI. The political challenge is to sustain, indeed even to imagine, democracy when the design of these powerful technologies is increasingly the means whereby political power is exercised. Achieving a better understanding of the nature of ethics is a key challenge because debates about ethical AI are characterised by an equivocation between about who needs to be ethical. Is it the people who design AI who need to be ethical, or do we need to be building ethics into the machines? Is it the machines themselves? And a significant proportion of both popular and academic discussion is concerned with the second of these possibilities, and I think that's a mistake. But that discussion is made plausible by engineers and indeed by philosophers operating with an impoverished account of what it means to be ethical. If we're utilitarians, then ethics is a matter of performing complex calculations about which actions will maximise some good, such as human happiness. But machines could be better calculators than we are. If we're Kantians, then ethics is a matter of applying the rules in a moral rulebook. And AI may eventually be capable of doing that better than us, at least more consistently than us. But if, as I've argued in a number of places, ethics is a matter of being properly responsive to the demands of human relationships, if our inspirations are Aristotle and Wittgenstein rather than Bentham and Kant, then ethics is closely connected with our embodiment. And to be ethical is to behave and feel and react in certain ways that only creatures with a particular biology are capable of. And if I'm right in this, then machines can't be ethical. Now, why does this matter? It matters because talk of machines being ethical distracts us from the people who are really making the decisions that determine the decisions that machines make and whose choices that we do need to be evaluating ethically. And in particular, it distracts us from the way in which the design of AI systems involves the exercise of political power, which brings us to the political challenge. To illustrate the nature of the political challenge, I'm going to ask you to entertain a small thought experiment. Imagine that a bearded Marxist revolutionary has hijacked a Fox News broadcast and appears on every television in the country waving an AK-47 and a manifesto. And in that manifesto, he says all and only the things that we hear about the impacts of AI. So he gets on television, he says his organisation is going to put 30% of the population out of work. It's going to censor the news that you read. It's going to determine who goes to prison, who gets a house to live in. It even determines who you get to meet and who you get to be friends with. Regrettably, he says, this will also require putting the entire population under extensive and permanent surveillance, and it will also involve me becoming fabulously wealthy. So imagine how people would react to that circumstance. I don't think anyone will say, fabulous, give that man a TED talk. Actually, what they'd say, that's appalling. That's an appalling exercise in shaping our future without consulting us. But that's what we're being asked to accept when it comes to the introduction of AI. And what the experiment reveals is a general democratic deficit in our thinking about technological change. And it's technology and not just AI here. Moreover, it seems to me that three of our traditional solutions to the exercise of political power by private actors seem no longer to be adequate. Consent, the notion that we can resolve this through individual consent, fails due to the ubiquitous nature of these technologies. The idea that we can just ask the state to regulate is problematised both by regulatory capture and the strong integration between the manufacturers, the designers and the state, and also the hollowing out of the state in our current political circumstances. And unfortunately, socialism, the universal basic income, is threatened by the collapse of the social forces that might bring it about. So that, it seems to me, is the political challenge, to imagine new ways of returning power to citizens, and it's not just an intellectual challenge, but a practical challenge. And I hope it's a challenge we will all take up.
All right, to bring us home and maybe answer some of those questions, artist Trevor Paglen.
Yeah, my talk's not called that anymore. It actually doesn't even have a title. I wanted to talk today about the pressing problem of Soviet socialist realist painting. That's really important. Because the thing with this kind of painting is that there's a kind of common sense built into these kinds of representations. There's a kind of underlying philosophy of transparency, of a more or less causal relationship between representations and things. The theory here is that representations are simple things, and then artwork should reflect that simplicity. And this is a kind of aesthetic regime that I think we're seeing a kind of strong reemergence of at the moment, actually, with this sort of thing. Now, obviously, one of the major, kind of a big application of AI is being able to analyze images. And this is what that sort of thing looks like: a green jacket, a white horse, a man on a horse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this kind of thing is evolving pretty quickly, the ability to kind of interpret images. Where's my next slide? There it is. Okay, here we are. This is evolving quickly in where newer systems are trying to not only recognize objects in scenes and in images, but being able to associate them with metadata and like metadata, if we will. You know, in other words, look at a meal and not only know what that meal is, but how many calories are in it. Look at a picture of a person and be able to estimate, you know, what's their body fat percentage, this sort of thing. And so there's a kind of aesthetic genre going on here that in some ways echoes socialist realism, but we can call it, I will dub it today, autonomous, hypernormal, meta-realism. And it does echo this kind of socialist realism kind of stuff, but here's the problem. Socialist realism fucking sucks. It really sucks. It's a really limited aesthetic and conceptual palette. And this is a feature of the genre. This is not a bug. And the reason for that is socialist realism is designed to make certain styles of thinking impossible. It's a means of centralizing power. It's a means of creating literally a kind of aesthetics of totalitarianism. So when we look back at this autonomous, hyper-neoliberal meta-realism, whatever, it has a lot in common with that, but I think it's potentially actually a lot more insidious for a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is because this kind of, it involves the autonomous attribution of meanings in the service of capital, right? It's a kind of hyper-realism that's designed to see and to only be able to see aspects of images that can be turned into capital. And what's more, it operationalizes those meanings. You know, at the most benign version of that, you know, your pictures might be used to try to sell you stuff. But it can also your pictures can have enormous consequences for your ability to get a job, get credit, be able to get insurance, and so on and so forth. And in this kind of autonomous realism, as many other people have pointed out, he who controls the training sets controls the meanings of images. And we have no or very few ways of trying to contest the meaning of those images. And this, of course, represents an enormous centralization of power. And what's more, this happens invisibly, done by proprietary systems that produce proprietary meanings in ways and places that are actually totally opaque to us. And this is one of the weirder aspects of this emerging art genre, if we want to call it that it's a visual system that lives alongside us and it makes persistent and kind of molecular interventions into our lives, but at the same time is largely invisible to us. This is a part of a very famous genre of images that Magritte made that he called the treachery of images. And the point of these paintings is to kind of show a tension between a kind of unexamined common sense that says this is an apple and the actual frangibility of meanings themselves. And I think this is not a semiotic stunt. This is a really important thing, because the freedom to say this is not an apple is the same kind of freedom to say I am a man or I am a woman or I am neither a man nor a woman, but I am a person. It's the freedom to say I'm a Palestinian. It's the freedom to say Black Lives Matter, to say I am beautiful. And its most basic, it's the freedom of self-representation that goes hand in hand with self-determination. And this is one of the many, many reasons why this advent of autonomous hyper-neoliberal mega-realism scares me so much. It's the fear that it robs us of our ability to determine ourselves by robbing us of the ability to define and the meanings of images for ourselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Trevor. And there may be some questions, so if you just want to take a seat, all of the panelists, what a note to go out on. I'm going to start scanning for hands. I see one. I see another. All right, so Jessa, and let's assemble the panelists. Great.
For those talks. So I have a fear that this question comment is going to come across as more combative than I mean it, but I want to talk about sci-fi a little bit, because I totally agree that mainstream imagery of artificial intelligence can reinforce some problematic values and perceptions. But I was thinking about how we could tie this to questions of representation. And I'm wondering if science fiction can also be productive, perhaps less in terms of how we imagine, figuring or representing or visualizing artificial intelligence, and more so in terms of figuring our relationships to technology. So thinking about the role of science fiction less in a first degree order of like how it looks, and more about how our relationships to those unfold. I'm saying this as someone who just read Octavia Butler's Parables of the Sower and was so much more inclined to become a prepper than any prepper website could ever make me. So it's like, I wanted to think about, in terms of questions of representation, sort of thinking maybe anthropomorphism isn't the problem. It's that the anthros that we imagine are so homogenous, and that if we were imagining different bodies, thinking about our earlier panels, or imagining animals in a positive sense, like why do they have to reproduce us? Why can't they reproduce other things? So just wondering if those might be questions that we could ponder.
Oh, absolutely. And I should say, I love science fiction. I think science fiction should be required reading for everyone in school. I think it really opens your mind up to, different possibilities and has exactly the effect that you say. So yes, I think it can be very helpful. I sort of, I guess, more meant, also, as you said, kind of the mainstream depictions of AI and robotics and sci-fi. I'm thinking, Terminator. I'm thinking major Hollywood movies. I'm not thinking, the science fiction that thinks deeply about society, like Ursula K. Le Guin or any of the other stuff that is thoughtful in that way. And it's just something that I've noticed in robotics in particular, that people are so primed through science fiction to have a very specific view of what the technology can and can't do, and they're not opening their minds the way that they should. So I would love to see more of the good science fiction enter the mainstream to open people's minds a little more.
Great. So we have quite a queue. I'm going to call out Peter and then Kathy. And I'm going to try to call on people who haven't asked a question yet and then get to the others at the end. But if we can do two at a time, because people are obviously inclined to questions. So, Peter.
Thanks. So I really like that ending note that Trevor left us with about self-representation and self-determination. I think it resonates a lot with this question of collective ethics that we had in the earlier set of discussions. But I'm wondering, to the extent that sort of historically marginalized groups were identified by being physically proximate in, say, a ghetto, or so recognize themselves as being of a class, of a gender, of a race, of an ethnicity, of a religious group. And now we have these algorithms that are classifying us in these inscrutable ways that are not transparent and are selectively then disproportionately treating us in different ways. How are we supposed to form a collective of a political will or a political identity or a self to represent and to determine when we are being cut up, as it were, into all of these different kinds of inscrutable groups? And so how do we get political, social action in that kind of framework?
Great question. And then let's get one from Kathy and see if the panel can. Here.
I feel guilty because I did ask a question before, but this will be quick. Just a thought experiment, which I've been playing with. I wanted you guys to think about it. I feel like the language of hype around this stuff has gone from big data objective to AI anthropomorphized. And for me, I'm wondering if you can see that as a sort of doubling down of the thing where the people building the algorithms say, this is not me with an agenda. This is something else. The first one was there is no agenda because it's objective. And now it's, if there's an agenda, it's the AI making the agenda. And I'm wondering how do we make the maker of the algorithm accountable to your position?
So I think there's something about a lot of this about subjects and objects. And again, looking toward humanities-based approaches, we might want to consider about the objectification that happens throughout, right? So when we begin to look at representation and different modes of representation, then we begin to have the possibility for subjectivity. But if we stick with visualization, or if we stick with algorithms speaking for algorithms, and sort of fetishization of the black box, I think we begin to step away from that possibility.
Yes, I was trying to suggest that some of the literature about ethics and AI, which says what we need to do is build ethical AI, is precisely a sort of conscious attempt to displace attention from the people who are wielding power over everyone who's engaged with those systems. And that power is wielded both in shaping the systems and shaping technological trajectories by investing in certain forms of research, but also in the social relationships that are developed and in the affordances of those technologies and the way in which those technologies reconfigure relations between people. I think we need to understand that as an exercise of power that should be within the purvey of a democratic politics. There's a general framing of technology now is we're going to solve a problem for you. Okay, instead of seeing the problems that the world faces as things that need to be addressed collectively, we're going to wait for the engineers to do it. And even if they got it right, that would be problematic because of the power relations. Now, how we shape new forms of subjectivity in that context, that's tricky because they do simultaneously individualise us as they categorise us, which is why I think the kind of new dot communism of the universal basic income is kind of interesting because it's not as though we haven't had people out of work forever. I mean, you could make an argument, that argument has been made for decades. And at the very moment when you see this massive collapse of the trade union movement, we're being sold this story, and it's a different story from different people, that, it's going to be okay because you'll all get a crust. And again, you need to see the power relations about being given a crust. In that context. I don't think there are easy answers here when it comes to forming subjectivities. They will be formed, though. I mean, people will self-identify with the ways in which they're classified, and they will come together under those classifications. But the fact that people are going to be geographically dispersed and dispersed across industries is going to make that problematic in ways that we'll see them play out.
All right, so we had Nathan, Stephanie, David, and if we could take kind of short questions in a clump, and then we'll try to get some others in after that.
So we'll go. Do you want to go to Nathan?
Thanks. I appreciate that we have kind of a range of people thinking about both art and the politics. As people propose, for example, ethics in machine learning, as well as these broader political movements, I've been struck by how the move towards ethics tries to keep power in the hands of people who are already building the systems, and how important political efforts are. So I'm curious to hear if there are kind of the opposites of the Russian constructivism. What kinds of art or representation, what kinds of stories, what kinds of political narrative might we turn to as we try to build the movements or institutions or policies that allow us to pursue justice in this time?
Trevor, maybe you want to give that a shot.
Me? Well, I'm just an artist. I don't know. I think there's a temptation that I see for a kind of new Leninism, right? Like appropriate the means of automation or something like that. That I'm kind of suspicious of. I don't. There's still huge power relationships in there that I would contest. I really don't know. I think it's a hard question. I really do. And even the idea of ethics in this conversation actually feels a little bit uncomfortable to me, because it implies that you can almost kind of have a ethical structure on top of capitalism kind of in relation to this. And maybe you can kind of around the edges a little bit, but I don't think that's where we're at, especially with these kind of systems evolving so much faster than the regulatory frameworks around them, which basically don't exist. Even in Europe, which is much better than the US on this stuff, there's still, thousands of years behind in terms of technology time. And so I even wonder whether framing this as a conversation about ethics is a good framework, as a place to even start. I would talk just very crudely, let's talk about capitalism, let's talk about neoliberalism, let's start from there.
I want to add two things to that. One thing is that right now it would be difficult to have the means, to rest the means if you wanted to, because there's no abstraction layer that an average person has access to. So rest the means all you want, but you're not making the data, you're not being counted, and you don't know what to do with it once you've got it. And the other thing, I think I forgot what I was going to say. I also wanted to suggest there are other mechanisms and means. There are things like speculative critical design, which often is ham-fisted and bad, but there's also some promising directions there in terms of designing and putting together different visions for futures. And the notion of ethical robots is baked into the beginning of machine learning. Warren McCulloch coined that term in 1956, wrote a series of papers about it, and so there was some thought to ethics back then, although I can't really speak right now to what that might have involved, in detail at least.
I think one tweet length point that we should continue to hammer home was it Alex Garland who did Ex Machina? Yeah. So he said in an interview, he said, AI does not have its own agenda. The people developing the AI have an agenda. I think that's a really important thing to hammer home.
Or the underlying structures that the people developing the AI are in the service themselves of have an agenda.
That's too long for a tweet.
So, just very quickly, it may be that the alternative ways of making the future simply aren't about AI at all. Mass migration of peoples, the Arab Spring, for all the, troubled history of that. There's stuff happening politically at the moment that is simply not about the relationship between engineers and populations and societies, or at least not from below. And we need to keep an eye on that as well when thinking about this stuff. The future is not just going to be made by engineers. It's also going to be made by people who struggle in every way they can to maintain a decent life in the face of all these technologies that are being rolled out. It's a political contestation, and one end of that may not engage with AI very much at all.
Great. So we're running up to time, so I want to get two quick questions from Stephanie and David, and then maybe a tweet-length comment from the panel, and then we're going to move to lunch.
So I was really provoked by Rob's terrorist on TV example, and so I would just want to ask, what is it about AI that makes us stupid? We had really popular resistance to the stopwatch or the assembly line or enormous databases in the 60s and 70s, but there seems to be this democratic deficit around AI in particular. So what is it about AI that is turning off popular resistance?
And I have a really practical question. When I think about ethics and governance and accountability and agenda setting, I think about access, probably because I'm a historian. I want to know who is making decisions and why are they making them, when are they making them, what do those infrastructures look like? And Molly pointed out, of course, that there's a very long legacy of defense funding, and with it, infrastructures of classification and censorship. People like me spend a lot of time filing Freedom of Information Act requests, trying very hard to unclassify or declassify records. But increasingly, also, of course, so much of this work is done in industry and is proprietary, not just the data sets and the models, but also the traces and records of how decisions are being made and who's making them and within what kinds of systems and communities. And I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts about how some of your concerns about the political dimensions and ethical dimensions of AI might map onto our thinking about where the records and the traces and the access might come for people like us in this room who want to ask those questions.
Great. So the good news is we're going to have a lot of time for discussion after lunch, and we are about right at time. So if any of the panel wants to offer a quick answer to those, but knowing also that we'll have time to talk over lunch and beyond.
I mean, I just want to totally agree with that, and that I hope we get to talk about this afternoon. It's also mentioned a little bit in the report draft. I don't know if you looked at it. So, I mean, that's part of why I didn't talk about that, is because I'm assuming it's going to be part of the larger conversation today.
So just in response to the first inquiry, I mean, I think one of the key questions here is about the causal relation between the introduction of a whole series of technologies that should be seen as part of the history of AI and the massive depoliticisation of the population that has occurred across the same period. And it may be that that's contingent, that it's just about the collapse of the trade union movement or the consolidation of capitalism, or it may be that these technologies are themselves producing new forms of subjectivity that mean people just go, oh yeah, look, there's something on Facebook, that's terrible, whatever. And that, it seems to me, a really important question in this debate at the moment.
Great. So now it's time to lunch. A few details. We're going to be back at our seats at 2:20, and then we're going to start the group discussion part. And that's where we get to try to digest the huge amount of input that our brilliant speakers kind of gave us today and think practically about what we need to do. So what are the research agendas? What do practitioners need to do to contend with these issues? What do advocates and civil society folks, how do those agendas begin to shape around this smorgasbord of pressing questions? So let's think about that. We want to come back. We're going to have a long discussion. And this is also where we say goodbye to the live stream. So thank you for joining us. That the discussion will be offline and candid, so we want people to be able to speak honestly. And we're really excited there. Again, if you have notes, provocations, questions you've written on your Post-its, we want to collect those. We want those to be fodder for that discussion. And remember our interactive wall. What is the most urgent thing this community needs to do in the next 12 months? And with that, please go get some food. We will see you back here promptly at 2:20. I'm looking at, yes, it is, 2:30. And before that, I want a huge round of applause for our speakers. That was absolutely fabulous. $2:30.